Hey everybody, what's going on? Welcome to another episode of Heavy Metallurgy number 175, 175 Fridays. Good to see Alan. Welcome back. We held the fort down for you last Friday.
Yep. I was doing family things there on the Labor Day weekend, so we all had a good time. Missed hanging out, watched the show. Looked like y'all had a really good time, and it went quite well.
And happy belated birthday on Wednesday. Cheers, 50. Woohoo!
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Everybody in the chat's giving you props for your making it around the planet and around the sun another year. So congratulations.
Yep. I didn't spin off or fall off the flat edges.
Falling off the edge of the world. Nope. Well, we have a bunch of people waiting in the wings here, and we could go on and on. But really, one thing I do want to get into here is the weekly releases that came out today, Friday, September 6th. See if I can do this without screwing up. I probably should put this down here. Okay, first up. 40 Watt Sun, Little Weight on Fisher's Folly. We've got Blitzkrieg, self-titled on Mighty Music, or Mighty. We got 3 albums that came out. It must be reissues by a band called Elephant Tree. I guess they're kind of like a stoner doom sludge type of thing. Habits, Handful of 10, and Thelia releases, all on Magnetic Eye. We've got Fast Eddie Clark, Make My Day, the rock and roll story of Fast Eddie Clark on BMG. God to Throne, The Judas Paradox on Reigning Phoenix. God is an Astronaut, Embers on Napalm Records. Jordan Rudess, Permission to Fly, Inside Out. That's the keyboardist for Dream Theater, for those of you who, because I didn't know who it was until I started looking up who it is, and shows you how big of a Dream Theater fan I am. Many Eyes, The Light Age on Perseverance. A Swarm of the Sun and Empire on Pelagic. Various artists, Surrender to Death, A History of the Atlanta Metal Underground, Volume 1 on Boris Records. This is a comp that actually Mike Seatown will be reviewing for Heavy Metallurgy in the near future.
That is a really good comp too. It's probably going to get buried among new releases this year, but yeah, I've heard it. It really does a nice job of covering, everything old all the way up to more current bands from the greater Atlanta area. And they did a really nice job with the track selection. They pulled some really good stuff. So it may seem like sometimes people look at that kind of thing as like, it's just like a local regional release. I think a lot of folks will be impressed with the range of stuff and the quality of the songs on it. So don't sleep on that one if you're interested in such things. It is a really cool compilation. They put a lot of work into it, you can tell.
Yes, Kellen Boris Records did the comp for sure. And in fact, Mike's band is on here too. His old band is on here. And lastly, we have Vestige Janus on Season of Mist. So that is that. Fancy slideshow. Thanks literally from Heavy Art Talk for showing me the way on that. Thankfully, I didn't have to call and ask him how to do it. I figured it out myself. But speaking of, let's get this gentleman out here returning from Heavy Art Talk. Lee, how you doing, man?
Doing great. Thank you for the invite. Very stoked to talk about this today.
Yep. Glad to have you aboard, as always.
Good to have you back on. And then, of course, this guy you see all the time. Kellen, whoa, what's going on?
Nothing much. Double duty this week. All right, back on Friday. Let's do it.
Has Corinne recovered from the trauma yet of the game show?
No, she still makes fun of the jacket, but
she should. I do
want to thank everyone who's tuned in and left a comment. She always enjoys reading them. So thank you for everyone who was watching and took the time to comment.
I can't believe you gave her like the 6-year-old Fisher Price letters to try to spell.
That ate up half the time. Her fishing the letters out. I'm like, you should just write it.
If you'd given her a marker and a blackboard, I think she'd have doubled her score.
Right.
So yeah, you really handicapped her with that.
Yeah. No one's going to win with that system. I mean,
right.
there's still bugs.
Everyone's the critic. I can't show up with the jacket. I got new things to show off, new props, and everyone just wants to give me a hard time about it. Enjoy the show. All right, you're welcome.
Between that and the glare off that jacket, I'm amazed she could even see to put the letters on the board, much less try to spell anything right.
All right. And, of course, the return of Lazerrus. Duane, good to have you back, sir. How you doing?
What's going on, guys? Hey, everybody. Saying hey to the chat, too. I'm trying to see who all's here. Good to see everybody. New Blitzkrieg. I'm excited for that. I didn't know about that till you said it. I didn't know it was this. I mean, I knew one was coming, but not this quick, so excited about that. Happy birthday to Alan joining the 50 Club.
Thank you.
I want to see Kellen pull off a Michael Jackson Thriller album cover in that jacket. With the
We all know that jacket made another appearance later in the house. You emerged from the bathroom out of the shower wearing nothing but the jacket. We all know. That would have been my move. Like, hey, baby.
Yeah, it's right in there with the B-roll for my Sacred Outcry promo. Right?
And that all explains why Kellen is broadcasting from the local Motel 6 tonight. Bryn changed the locks.
Yes. Well, thank you all for joining us. Great. It's good to have all you back, of course, as always. And actually, Duane came up with a topic for tonight that he threw it out there, and the more we got to talking about it, it seemed like it had a lot of moving parts. That's why there's a lot of people here tonight. Duane, what are we doing tonight?
Being a little morbid, I guess.
Are you morbid, Duane?
Yeah, I've been listening to a little too much Sisters of Mercy and things like that lately.
About
But no,
Celtic
I was just thinking, as Alan can now relate now that he's in the 50 Club, as we are getting older, our generation of metal heroes are becoming fewer and fewer, whether it's retirement or going into the ground. And the legacy bands, the big ones. I've always made the comment that your bands like Iron Maiden and Judas Priest, to me, is like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones to my dad, right? So these bands, and I'm 54. I was 10 when I discovered Maiden, and so it's like just part of my life, as it is many of us. We all have these bands that they've just been with us almost our entire life since we were pre-teens or teens. And the mortality of it kind of just had me thinking, the day is going to come when they're just not there anymore. And
It's coming soon too.
yeah, and so what kind of effect is that going to have? I mean, a lot of them we've already lost, right? Ronnie James, a lot of these heroes have already been lost. Some have been gone for a long time. But when the metal bucket runs dry of the legacy acts, and when I say legacy acts, I'm primarily thinking, late 70s, early 80s to present day. So yeah, Motorhead's a good one. I know Alan came up with the theory of a legacy band being a band that could fill a stadium, right? And that's definitely true. I mean, that's, there's definitely bands that have been around for 40 years that can fill a bar, but that's as far as they ever got after 40 years, so these are legacy bands. And what's going to happen when they're gone? Are we going to have more legacy bands in the next generation? Is the name legacy band going to die at that? And Alan and Marty came up with a fabulous idea to pull Kellen and Lee in here, so we can have two sides of the coin here. We can have two generations going on how it'll affect each generation, and then each of us personally, I guess. And I'm not trying to be morbid or have a focus on mortality and things like that, but it's just, I guess what really got me thinking about it originally was when we lost Neil Peart from Rush, because I'm a big Rush fan, and that one hit really hard, and a lot of these musicians have died recently. To me, it's recently, but we lost David Bowie, Prince, a lot of those guys, and to me it was like, oh man, that sucks. That's terrible. But when Neil Peart died, that made me go. And Rush announced they were done. I was like, wow, I never thought about the day of there won't be another Rush record. I hadn't really thought about it, until it hit me square in the face. And when it does that, it gets you thinking, who's next, right? And so that's just kind of where the idea came from.
It starts you thinking about your own mortality too. Not that you get to be our age, that's something that's always in the back of our mind anyway. Actually, it goes from the back of our mind to the forward part of our mind a little bit more.
Yeah.
Some of these bands we've always loved and worshipped are all suddenly either croaking or retiring. You're like, wait a minute, that means I'm old, Anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. And then so in talking this subject out, Ellen also came up with the idea of, picking 5 albums a piece that are 5 albums from legacy acts that we think will still be predominantly important. In what year did you say, Alan? Like 20?
I was thinking about 2050 or so. The idea being most of these bands we are kind of referencing tonight will probably be done sometime this decade, within the next 5 to 10 years. And so then I was thinking so 25 or 20, 25 years down the road, which ones really hold up and stand the test of time, and which ones kind of start to fade out and maybe don't get the same respect down the road.
Yeah, and so for example, you have Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon, right? It is 2024. That album is 40, I got to do the math, 40 to 50 years old, right? Mm-hmm. And it still sells like crazy and is still looked upon as one of the most important albums of the rock genre. Some prog crossover, however you want to categorize Pink Floyd, that album kind of categorizes itself. It's a legendary record. It sold millions. The Beatles' Abbey Road. Okay, these albums, Jimi Hendrix Experience, first album. These albums that are still today, staples in any record store, and any new collector that's in the rock genre will eventually have these fall into their collection and be enjoyed still to this day. So that's the kind of thing we were kind of thinking about in the metal genre. What are going to be 5 albums you think are going to fit that category that are still selling, still being pressed? Maybe it's on its 20th repress at that point, if vinyl's still going then, but whatever, it is. What are the 5 albums that you chose that you can foresee being like those classic albums? And that's pretty much it. And then just to kind of talk, Alan did a beautiful outline on keeping us on topic, because there are some other questions relating to this that have been developed. And to get Kellen and Lee's side as a newer generation on how it may affect them. Okay, because to me, these are our bands that we were young and grew up with, and they discovered them later. So maybe the loss won't be as great. Maybe it still will. Let's find out.
All right.
Well said, Duane. Yep.
Very well said. Yep.
That's very much, it's a great job kind of outlining where we're going to head. And let's see. So let's sort of, jump into it here. I'll just kind of follow the outline that we've all, been working on for the past week or two. And one thing that some folks are asking in the chat already, and this is a good point to clear up off the bat, is, what do we mean by legacy band? It's a phrase we might lean on a lot tonight. For purposes of this conversation, we're really using it in the context of, the big name, like, household name type bands. Yes, I agree with some folks in the chat. You can make the case that, any band, once they've been around for, say, 25, 30 years or something, can count as a legacy band. But when we were developing this topic amongst ourselves, we were really thinking about, the giants of the scene, the bands that even people who maybe don't listen to metal anymore would still recognize, or people who never listen to metal much would automatically know, oh yeah, I know that name. I at least know that's a huge heavy metal band. They don't have to be as huge today as they once were, but they're the bands that have worldwide acclaim, over decades of time. So just examples, and probably ones that we'll just use as like the kind of default examples tonight would be Judas Priest and Iron Maiden. But other bands could certainly fall in that category: Motorhead, Slayer, even things like Scorpions would fall under this kind of umbrella. So we're not talking as much about small, legacy bands like Duane said, the ones that can still fill bars or small venues. Sure, you could call those bands legacy bands. They're not going to have quite the same impact when they retire or go away, though. If Saxon has to hang it up in 6 months, that doesn't have quite the same impact as if Iron Maiden has to hang it up in 6 months. So just for purposes of tonight's conversation, we're kind of focusing more on those, huge name bands not quite as much the smaller ones. So I just want to make sure we were all kind of on the same page about how we want to use that phrase for the legacy band tonight.
Okay. I don't know. Hopefully I came at this in the right way. But anyway, we'll get there.
Did you not read the homework, Marty?
I read the homework multiple times, and I just don't, other than the key big bands that have always been around, I don't know the modern day scene that well. I don't know. I mean, Five Finger Fruit Punch,
That's why over on this side, we have some guidance over here too.
Right. So, I mean, some of my picks, like what bands will fill the role, I mean, they might be a little shaky. But we'll see.
That may be. Yeah, that may be. And that's something, another reason that we brought in, people of different ages and different backgrounds who might see that differently. But yeah, so I guess, just the sort of first question is, how do we each sort of think it's going to impact the heavy metal scene when some of these big staple bands have to hang it up? And like Marty has said earlier, the time is coming. Maybe Iron Maiden and Priest and their contemporaries, maybe they get another album out, maybe they get 2 more albums out. But sometime in the next 5 to 10 years, these guys are going to be turning 80. And you got to figure at that point, there's just nothing left in the
It's
tank.
physically impossible.
Time will catch up and just make it impossible. So how do we foresee what, the announcement comes out, pick some of these, bands, Scorpions are gone. Judas Priest sadly has someone pass away. Ozzy Osbourne is one that very much fits this category. What happens when the Prince of Darkness dies? How does that affect his legacy, the band's legacy, and how does the heavy metal community react to it? Let's get to Kellen and Lee in on this. Lee, let's start with you. What do you think? How does the heavy metal community react when these big bands have to come to an end?
So I think there's a little bit of difference between when the band stops touring or completely retires versus a death.
Mm-hmm.
I think
good point.
Whenever there's a death, there's a bunch of media that obviously goes out about that, and I do think that media could introduce folks who are like really young, like Gen Alpha, Gen Z, that maybe aren't that familiar with those bands and that legacy. When it comes to the bands actually retiring, though, I think it will impact folks that are in the, and I'll be talking a lot about like generations, because that's kind of how I framed this entire assignment. But for folks that grew up with those bands, I think it will like impact them. It'll make them sentimental and stuff, and it will impact because the headliners of really big festivals could be gone, especially at festivals that are more like, classic rock into classic metal type of thing. For me personally, Black Sabbath, Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, those are bands that were like passed down to me, so to speak, not by my parents, but just by the internet and stuff. Like I found out about them once they were like already 50. You know what I mean? So yeah. They never were a band that I was like, oh, they're like my age, I can relate right to them. It was always like, do your homework, understand tradition, understand where roots came from, and respect them. So when they do retire, I think it'll just be like, tip my hat, but I probably won't think too much of it, because when I do remember those bands, I'm going to be looking at their footage of like the 80s and the 90s. I'm going to be like, oh yeah, when they were like, 35 and under, like what were they like? How were they writing? What was it like in the studio? I'll be wanting to read the books of that, not necessarily the books of like them when they're, playing poker in their 60s or something. So I think a lot of it is just like the age and when you come into that music, the relatability factor. So hope that's coherent, but that's probably how I feel. It won't impact me as much as others, I don't think.
Okay. Kellen, what's your take on this?
I mean, I very much agree on my personal listening habits won't be affected, or I don't identify by any means with the musicians in a way that would feel personal, right? Like I don't have a childhood with these bands. So I just, the first thing that jumps out at me though, if how it will affect metal, and this is where Lee and I can kind of pass it back to you. I look at the bands that you're naming, at least in my mind, there's like a certain kind of identity that they possessed, which was being like relevant to culture in a way that was broad sweeping, that could bring in sort of like pop culture awareness, while at the same time having respect within the metal community. And that's something that I've always felt was a major division growing up. Like, I never felt the bands that I personally identified with were ever going to be filling stadiums. Like that was just something that did not exist from the artists that I identified with and I saw myself as a part of. So, like, the very premise of the question points to like a generational division that I just have never participated in and don't understand. I think, so it won't affect necessarily my, my personal listening habits. It always is amazing to me, however, when, a major band, like what was the last Metallica record, 72 Seasons, when it infiltrates different parts of my day-to-day life that other metal bands do not touch, right? And I think that kind of like heavy metal sort of penetrating parts of cultural awareness and acceptance, I think, that will potentially go away. I don't think that whoever's taking that mantle will essentially have the same kind of pull and
I agree.
background, and I just don't think
They don't have the sauce. They don't have the songs.
The first thing I went to go, look is like, who's the #1 metal band on Spotify? And last year in 2023, Linkin Park had more streams than Metallica.
Yep.
And I just think, like, if I'm completely separate from that world, like I do not swim in that. But I think if you want to talk about, there's a band that, has a death, whatever, but like, I don't feel it was relevant in any way to talking to metal in the way that we're speaking to it tonight. To talk about Linkin Park's Hybrid Theory in the same breath as Number of the Beast is a complete, like, yeah,
it's
right.
Wrong. It's wrong.
It's totally wrong. So yeah, I just think there's a fundamental disconnect there.
I got one quick thing, if I can.
Sure.
When you were talking about, like the Metallica 72 Seasons, like hitting different parts of your life than you expected. When I was preparing for this, I literally asked my coworkers, like, who do you think are the biggest metal bands? Like, just normies, right?
That's a good idea.
Because like my whole thing with this was, and I'm not going to get any, you guys are probably going to be dissing me in the chat. I wanted to see the macro, the large, majority of metal fans that would never even participate in a Friday live stream, because frankly, everyone who's here on the panel, in the chat, you guys are the metal diehards. But there is a sea of casual metal fans. And that's why these Spotify numbers of Linkin Park are so high, because there's a lot of fair weather fans of metal, and like, that's fine. It's just
and they
the
think
reality.
that is metal. They think that's metal because they don't know any different.
Right. So I studied a lot of, I was like looking at Loudwire and shit, because I was like trying to understand that side of it, preparing for this. That was all.
Mm-hmm. No, that's really good insight, Lee, for sure.
Yeah.
Let's see. Duane,
What are your thoughts,
you want to
Duane?
jump in on this?
Yeah, so I would say, the big thing here is that we are talking about a genre that has more subgenres than probably any other style of music. Kind of like Kellen was saying, Linkin Park, Metallica, right? How about Scorpions, Immortal, totally Twisted Sister and Death Leprosy, right? Completely different. So that's where it gets kind of, we're playing in a sandbox here that is the size of a swimming pool. So it's going to be kind of tough to kind of channel a lot of what we're trying to talk about tonight, for sure. But I think that when the band, whatever band is going, right, whether they're retiring, and actually that was a good point you brought up, Lee. There's a difference between retirement and death on how it will affect someone, for sure. Okay. If Ozzy just says, "Okay, that's it. I just can't do it. I was going to try, but I'm going to go ahead and spend the rest of my days with the family in England. Maybe keep the YouTube thing going or something. Okay, cool, man. God bless you, Ozzy. Thank you so much for everything, blah, blah, blah. But if I wake up tomorrow and I sign on to Facebook, which for some reason seems to be where it always hits me, right? I'll sign on to Facebook and rest in peace. There's someone.
See who died. Yeah.
God, yeah. And so I sign on and it says Ozzy died. I am affected emotionally a lot more that way than if he just retires, from an announcement. Okay. So, and that's kind of what happened with me and Rush when Neil Peart died. And what happened to me was I walked away from Rush after that. And not because I'm like, it just, I couldn't bear to spend time listening to Rush for a while. Like it was like this weird subconscious, like mourning thing. Like I just couldn't, process there for a long time. And now I can just fine. I came to terms with their retirement, etc. So I think there is a way on how a band disbands, let's say, or artist is going to affect their legacy. If, let's say, Maiden announces that they're going to retire and they do a farewell tour, which seems to be a thing nowadays, and repeat, but they do a farewell tour and they bring on Paul Di'Anno and they bring on Blaze Bayley and they just make it a big old happy Maiden party, right?
They won't.
That's a celebration. That's and that kind of stuff will gain more fandom, will establish a higher level of fandom, I think, than if they just announced quietly that they're retiring and they just exit slowly down the dark hallway. And how it will affect metal, that question, Alan, is a tough one because again, I can't come up with an answer for that because again, I think of the big sandbox that we're playing in. It's more about how will it affect that particular style of metal, okay? Because a lot of these legacy bands have influenced future bands, right? So in theory, it's still kind of continuing. I mean, we have all these new wave of British heavy metal bands, new wave of traditional heavy metal bands, that are going now, but and we won't even dip into power metal yet. But so, you ask a lot of these guys, hey, what's your inspiration? Randy Rhoads, Iron Maiden, right? That it's, and you ask those guys, like, yeah, Steve Harris from Iron Maiden, it's going to be Thin Lizzy UFO, and then you can kind of trace it back and it just keeps going back. So the bands that are going to carry on in metal, I think metal will continue just fine. But as time goes on, the influences of the current legacy bands over time is going to, I believe, eventually finally subside or not peak, but plateau at a certain point, and that's just where it's going to kind of remain as just, like I was talking about with Dark Side of the Moon and Abbey Road and stuff like that. Those are just, Fleetwood Mac Rumors. Those are just classic albums that are they're plateaued. They're known as classics. They're almost expected to be owned and listened and enjoyed by people, and so people do. That's what I kind of think will happen. So it's about the best I can say on that, I think.
Okay,
All right.
Marty, I think you're champion at the bit. Jump on in here.
I'm not. All right. I think I've already experienced this a little bit. My band growing up was Kiss. I've said it on here a million times. I was 7 years old. 78, 77-ish. I've heard them, and I'll always, even though it's a band I love and a band I hate at the same time, I'll always champion them as being the band that got me into music, that made me look past, things that my parents liked and actually started getting into my own stuff. So Lee kind of nails it on the head. Death is different. Death is a finality to it. It's a sadness thing. You got these bands like Kiss, Maiden, Priest. They're kind of like a parent in a way. If your parents are still with you, you go through life. You don't know what it's like with your parents not being there. They've always been there. They've been there since you were born, obviously. It's kind of the same with some of these bands, these legacy bands. And when they retire, it's a little bit different. Like when Kiss retired, long overdue. Let's be honest. I felt a little nostalgic and weird when they decided they were done, but I was good with it. I'm like, okay, this needed to happen a decade or so ago or more ago. If one of the guys would have died, it might have been a different situation, other than the fact that I've watched enough interviews over the years to realize I don't like any of those dudes. As a person, I don't know how I would feel about it, other than we all as music fans, we hear a person's creative output and we attach a personality and traits to the person behind it. And we don't know them. We have no idea who these people are. So to put some of these people on such a high shelf isn't necessarily fair to the artist, and it's really not fair to yourself. We get an idea what people are like in interviews and stuff, but they're trying to market their band. They're trying to promote their band. They're letting the fans see what they want them to see. So I always get weird when I find myself getting emotional, like when Dio died. I'm like, oh my God, I felt a little something like, oh, like, I don't know the guy. I mean, it's so weird. It's so weird. Yet then I hear someone, like a friend of a friend died, and I have like zero emotional response to it. It's just a weird headspace to get in. So a lot of these bands retiring and facing the end, I'm most of my emotions on it are how I'm perceiving it, how my nostalgia plays into it. Yeah, I'm kind of going around and around here, but I think I'm getting the point here. I think the passage of time is undeniable, and it's just really strange seeing these bands, hearing their later output. Although I will say Judas Priest is aging incredibly well. Granted, there's a lot of new blood in the band, and probably some studio tricks. I've watched some live stuff. Halford doesn't sound exactly like the album, but hey, I think he's mid-70s at this point. It's all those moving parts, they're going to break down after a while. Some bands are aging more gracefully than others. It's going to come down to a time. As long as no one croaks, I think I'm okay with retirement. I'm okay with retirement. But thinking about what lies beyond, I don't know how it's going to impact things. It's going to be weird. And we're going to get into that later. Alan, what are your thoughts on this stuff?
Can I comment on something you said real quick,
course.
Marty, before you get going, Alan?
Oh, yeah.
When you brought up, like, when Dio died, you were like, oh my God, but then you have a friend of a friend that passes away, and you're just no care in the world, right?
Well, there's a care, but it feels different. It doesn't, I don't have a friend of a friend living with, making me feel better through all good times and bad times. You know what I mean?
Probably not thinking about that friend of a friend a week from now, right?
Probably not.
Unless it's brought up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so what made me think when you said that is that because you said it's not like I know the guy, right? It's not like Ronnie James, right? Personally. And that made me think, is it the sadness, the shock, the disbelief, the whatever the feelings are, is it for the artist, or is it for the memories you've shared with the artist because their music has soundtracked your life?
It's exactly what it is. It's a selfish, because this music all impacts us differently. I mean, I get goosebumps from music. I'm sure we all do. I mean, you don't throw yourself into a musical culture. People use music like wallpaper. They just do. Oh, I like whatever's on the radio. I mean, I never could understand people like that. I just don't get it. But, with us, we're so into it. We have to buy it, own it, wear it, our dress code. I mean, the whole damn thing. It becomes part of our identity. And again, we don't know the people that are making it, but we think we do because of the way they make us feel.
You spend so much time with them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whether it's spinning a record, watching a video, whatever it is, flipping through a magazine, you're sharing your life with this artist or band or whatever the case is.
Yep. And I'm not a guy that gets really super starstruck, but seeing Halloween, being 10 feet from the stage, seeing him up there, I'm like, whoa. I like, this is weird. This isn't on a video.
Hi, right there. He's right.
This isn't, wow, look how short he is. Yeah, I'm just like, wow, look how tiny he is. Like Keebler Elf with an awesome guitar. It's weird. And I, never really grew up being in that position. When it hits me, it's kind of like, what are these feelings I'm feeling? This is strange. Idol worship? I don't know. Anyway, I think we got off topic a little bit there.
Sorry, Alan, I didn't mean to cut you off.
My bad.
No, that's fine.
So.
Anybody have anything, chime in. This is an open forum here for sure.
Yeah.
Alan, your thoughts?
Yeah. Folks have brought up some good points. Death and retirement are different. With death, you often, I think, as Duane said, you kind of get that, spike in interest because people see it in the headlines. It's like, oh, yeah, I used to listen to them 20, 30 years ago. And so all of a sudden they're, dialing it up on YouTube or Spotify or record stores see this all the time, that all of a sudden, they'll sell out of whatever albums they have by a band, within a few days of when somebody passes away, and it kind of makes the news cycle. So, yeah, that's different. People's reaction will vary a lot just depending on how close they were to the band. Everybody's kind of sad about it. Some people, have a really strong reaction, like Duane described with Rush. For some people, it's more just kind of, that little, okay, well, today's a little bit worse, but it doesn't, have a longer impact. The retirement thing is a little tricky to think about because we haven't had a lot of the big name long-term metal bands actually retire. And this was one of the things that we talked about a lot at first with this idea getting formed. Metal bands seem to persevere and persist a lot longer than maybe bands in other genres do. And maybe that's not a perfect comparison, but in a way, metal fans are a bit spoiled in that we haven't had to watch a lot of our big bands just hang it up and go away. Or, if they did, they've all come back, or they had that rough patch in the 90s where they kind of were very low visibility for a bit. And then they bounced back and, got on the nostalgia train and signed the Nuclear Blast contract that says you will make 7 albums that sound like your classic output and everybody will love you again. But, we haven't had a lot of those things disappear. The closest ones, I guess, are Motorhead and Slayer. But, most of the other giants of the field are still kicking around. And so we haven't had an accumulation. And it strikes me as a little funny because, yes, so many of these bands, the members are very much in retirement age. If they were working other, sort of typical types of jobs, they would be, turning in their, hey, I've done my 30 years, put me on Social Security, and I'm punching out. But the metal musicians really haven't done that. And so we're still, benefiting and enjoying their presence. Sure, maybe some of them aren't as good as they used to. Sure, some of them we may not, be as into their output. Others, may still be going strong, and we do. So I'm really not sure how the retirement thing will play out. Yes, you don't have that same sadness as somebody dying, but if we start to see a lot of these bands fully retire, in a short time frame, again, like within the next 5 years, if you have, Priest, Maiden, and picking out 5 others,
Saxon.
Well, except, is done. AC/DC ends up being done. And you're like, all these big, name bands are all just like, our health is too bad and we don't want to break in new members. This band has one member pass away and the others decide they don't want to carry on without him. And another band just decides, we're all in our upper 70s and road travel and putting in hours in the studio. We just physically and mentally, we don't want to. We can't do that anymore, or we don't want to spend our last, few years doing that. We want to be able to do what you do when you retire, sit back, relax, enjoy the fruits of your, life of labor and not have to keep churning through it. So it'll be interesting to me to see, how people do react when all of a sudden they realize that it's not, just death, but that the bands are just off the radar. They take themselves off the playing field, and it starts, happening, this band retires in early 2027. End of 2027, another band retires. 2028, a third band retires. And you start looking at the heavy metal landscape, and it's going to look really different then. Not because of death necessarily, but just because, yeah, everybody kind of, hit that critical point close together. And what do you do then? Because, yeah, you don't have that same sad nostalgic reaction, but a lot of the bands, as Duane articulated earlier, that you've grown up with, that you've listened to your whole life, it's just like, see ya, we're off to the Riviera or the old folks home, whatever our finances allow, but we're done here. And you just don't have them anymore. So it will be interesting to see how that happens, because we haven't experienced it very much in heavy metal. But like I said, other than Motorhead and Slayer, for bands on that level, not a lot of them have had to disappear. So I'm not really sure how it'll play out. But it kind of blends into our next question here, which is when this happens, and again, it has to happen one way or the other. Within, I'd say, maybe there's a 10-year window. But for some of these artists, if they're currently in their early 70s, I just don't see them doing it into their early 80s. So once those bands are gone for whatever reason, are there bands like, up and coming that we think are going to step in and fill that role? Are there new bands that are already kind of, getting to that level of popularity? It's obviously going to be, yes, a younger fan base, and that's, again, why I'm really interested to hear Lee and Kellen's thoughts on this, because it may not be artists that, Duane, Marty, and I really think of in the same way or know about, but does metal just get like, a new tier of superstars, or do we just end up kind of lowering the ceiling, and now the top tier bands are the ones that, can sell at, the 5,000 kind of seat places, or, the 3,000 seat places, but you never, again, have bands on, that huge, 10,000 kind of level popularity when it comes to selling places out. So let's rotate back to Lee. Lee, are there bands that are going to become the next Iron Maiden and the next Priest, or is that just not a thing that's going to occur?
Thanks, Randy, so much.
I mean, I think they will, like, in their own way. I think the thing I just want to address to you guys and then everybody else is, like, I don't expect Duane to all of a sudden be like, you know what, I'm going to become a Slipknot fan and I'm going to go to their amphitheater show. It's like, I'm not foolish enough to think that.
Oh, Duane is going to be so down with the sickness.
Yeah. So it's not going to be like a migration of fans. Like, I'll tell you, everything I'm going to say, I feel like I'm just going to get light up. Let me give you an example of a time when there was a migration of fans. All right? Hear me out.
Sure.
When Grateful Dead retired, all of their fans followed Fish.
Yep.
That's not going to happen in metal, in my opinion. I think you guys are going to hold on to your classics in a lot of respects. But that being said, the numbers don't lie in terms of, and I used both critical acclaim, but a lot of like Spotify numbers, ticket sales, things like that. Bands like Deftones and Slipknot are gigantic in the macro sphere. You might not like them, but they sell a lot of tickets. So when we're talking about legacy bands, I think folks that are Gen Z, Gen Alpha, kind of middle to younger millennials, we grew up with some of those bands. So like, they're not the same. Like, I don't put them on the same sphere, but in terms of popularity, I get it, and the numbers don't lie. So metal is just going to look different in the next generation. And I think another thing that's going to be more and more common is the benchmark of heaviness is going to continue. Like, for instance, a 10-year-old right now probably is not going to be shocked at all by Black Sabbath, maybe not even Cannibal Corpse. Like, Extremity is just going to keep getting added. And there's going to be even more so heaviness, not really metal, like, bullet belts and leather, but heaviness is going to permeate hip-hop, pop, and even country, even more so. I swear to you. It's already happening, but it's just going to continue to, because they're trying to find something that's going to attract a lot of attention. So I guess the ultimate thing that the question is, are there going to be bands that like replace them? No, but there will be big festivals like Sick New World that will do a lot of ticket sales. It's just not the metal that is perceived like Ozzy and Iron Maiden, Metallica, and Megadeth. That is a once in a lifetime thing. So that's kind of how I feel about it.
It's a good point.
Great
Good
points.
Point. Well said, Lee.
Thank you.
So, Kellen, what do you
I
think?
mean, Lee kind of touched on one of the questions that you had posed in the outline, which was, do they only hail the old classics or do they embrace younger ones? I feel, as much as I'll tune into the VC and people want to show off the newest Iron Maiden record, I don't know how often they make your like end of year list, right? Or you think it's the best thing. Maybe your collector scum personality picks it up, but it might not be the favorite thing you listen to all year. Like, I don't think people who have, for Duane or Marty or Alan, like people who've been listening to these bands for the longest time, they haven't failed to embrace, younger bands. When we do the end of the year stream, is one of the consistent themes is like, as much as people complain there's nothing great going on every year, there's a bunch of new records that came out and younger bands were putting out legitimate and, worthy material. So, I mean, I just want to kind of open back that question to the three of you is like, is the idea that somehow when Iron Maiden or Black Sabbath finally hang it up, if someone were to say, well, people of your generation will stop listening to metal, that's a crazy presumption, no?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. But yeah, I think the question is, to some extent, how many of them just are like, well, they just stick to that. They're like, these are my bands. I'm not interested in anything else. So I'm just going to sit here and be sad for a while and just listen to all my old Iron Maiden records and not really give a crap about anything else. Versus like what you said, Kellen, will some people still enjoy those albums and still appreciate those bands, but not necessarily try to replace them, with a new band, but just be like, well, I still want to, keep tabs on what's coming out and what new bands are coming up.
I mean, and I guess I'll just kind of piggyback off of Lee's sentiment. If you had told me, or anyone, when Mayhem first showed up, murdering one another and committing suicide, that fast forward a few decades, that there'd be a Netflix document, like fiction, whatever movie on them,
And books.
like the level of, and I see people, right? I think that band, it's not just people wearing Van Halen t-shirts or Metallica t-shirts. Like that band, for example, is one that at one point in time was the most controversial band in all of metal. Now they've reached a level of like awareness and pop culture legitimacy for them to have a streaming movie, right? Like that is, to me, a sign to Lee's point about like where we see extremity, or what we perceived extremity to be sort of a potentially limiting factor and how big a band could be. The fact that Cannibal Corpse has been around for this long and are huge and have turned this career that was at one point in time, Bob Dole on his presidential campaign talking about how they're a problem in American society. Now I think they're much more accepted than what we would have thought of in the mid 90s, for example, 3 decades later. So I think if we're going to talk about that balance of, commercial success, cultural relevance, and also like an important catalog in metal's history, I think that's kind of where I'm leaning as to what are the bands that'll potentially be moving into Iron Maiden or Judas Priest spot. That's for me, like the first thing that comes to mind is like, that's going to be at least the standard to which we understand heavy metal in 2025 going forward.
Okay.
Yep. And the counter to that also, or the inverse, is do people who are like 15 or 20 now, if they heard Rainbow or Scorpions or even Black Sabbath, is that just a classic rock band to them? Like there might be a retcon of what metal actually is and what it started as, because the expectation now is if you tell someone you like metal, they immediately are making the assumption that you like something with growling vocals. They're not thinking, oh, you like Dio per se. that's not the usual assumption. So I'm curious to that as well in like 2050.
All right.
Oh, good points. Duane, your turn to take a stab at this one.
Yeah, that's what you guys are talking about is, that's where the term dad rock comes in, right? Because that's like I like how Lee brought up how it's just going to continue to get heavier and heavier and heavier, and with that, your previous acts become lighter and lighter in that process. So that's where the new, like, I would never call Black Sabbath, classic rock, right? But I can see my grandson one day going, yeah, that's classic rock, because to them, that's probably what it is. It's not heavy enough to what they're used to. Just like, early, 50s rock, doo-wop stuff to me is not rock and roll. It's its own thing, but it just has an old sound to it, so it's just not from my generation. So that is going to be something that I think is going to be unavoidable. That's just going to be unavoidable. It's going to be the continuing acts and the continuing bands referencing those previous bands in regards to inspiration or just giving them kudos and acknowledgement in the history of metal that will keep them going, that will keep that memory alive and that respect there to those bands. But it's a very, very interesting thing. I think, the bands that are going to continue, be the next Judas Priest, be the next Iron Maiden, I don't know. I don't know if there is going to be those bands. I think the arena filling metal acts may be few and far left. They're just, that may be a generational thing. The time was the 80s. I mean, even when we went through the pandemic, concerts ceased, right? And I think a lot of people just kind of fell out of the practice, unless you're, absolute nutcases like we are. But the primary, people out there that just are casual fans and whatnot probably, hardly go to concerts now, So I don't know if a metal band will be able to fill an arena, 10,000 seat arena going forward, just because of society's view of how they digest music. Maybe I'm wrong, that's possible.
And to jump in real quick, Duane, Lee mentioning things getting heavier and heavier and heavier. I agree with that, and you already see some instances of it in death metal, but there's a ceiling to that. You can only get so heavy and get so crazy that it's going to completely alienate half of your fan base, because someone made a mention in here, it becomes more about sound than it does about songs. And you can't lose, the tenets of music like melody and all these things and appeal to a wider audience. You just can't. I mean, if all of a sudden, country's getting heavier, that's going to have to be a special young fan base that gloms onto that, because the middle-aged to the older people, that's not going to fly. I mean, my dad looks at stuff like Jelly Roll, and he's like, this sucks. I mean, he hates that crap. And, those sad bastard country, that stuff, it's dark, it's lonely, it's miserable, but singing's off key. I mean, people, there's a certain ear of a person that likes that. Anyway, I didn't mean to get into there, but the heaviness, what I'm saying is,
Lily's comment.
Yeah, but the heaviness, I agree, but there's a ceiling to it. You can only go so far before you alienate a wider fan base, and that's going to put music further underground and keep them away from moving into the bigger theaters and the stadiums. But anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, Marty. I think that, also to keep in mind that what tends to happen with society is history will tend to come back and repeat itself from time to time too, and so when it gets to that heavy level that, like Lee brought up with, there's going to be that band that goes, you know what, we just can't come up with anything heavier. We can't, we're all starting to sound the same. What do you guys think about doing a early 80s thrash style, you know, and then all of a sudden this new, you know, new wave of heavy metal, wherever it comes from, let's say
New wave of Bay Area thrash.
yeah, yeah. New wave of South American metal happens, right?
Yeah.
You know, so that could be something that may have a little bit of life to it. Will it explode? No, but I think that kind of thing will tend to happen. It's happening now with you know, classic metal, speed metal, early American power metal. There's all these new bands that are doing that now by revisiting the past like that. So I think that might always be there. I think that what's going to create that legacy level act or band is going to have to be tapping into something that's quite original in a way. And what I mean by that is, let's say, like, you know, when Kiss came out, okay, Kiss is a blues rock foundation, okay, but what they did visually, okay, and whatnot, and the merchandising behind them, and the cross-pollinating into, you know, television and film, and they were just everywhere, right? That kind of thing is what creates something like that. And the only band I can really think of right now, because it's a new band that could become a legacy band, love them or hate them. And in my generation, that's how it goes. You either love them or you hate them. I actually love the band. But Ghost is a band that has found their own thing and has gained huge fandom and can sell out arenas. You know, they have a fair amount of albums already under their belt. And that is a band that could go on and become, you know, 20 years from now, you know, avid Ghost collectors, and just, you know, if they're still going, and, you know, they're on, you know, Papa 37 or whatever the hell it is, you know, and, you know, but they tapped into something. I don't want to say musically they're original and whatnot, but they did kind of create this new thing, you know. They're not black metal, but they're embracing the satanic thing, and yet they make fun of it, and yet I don't know, they're just in their own thing. So that's the kind of thing I think that would have to create something that's going to be on par with the legacy bands that we're discussing here. You know, it's going to take something like that. Another band, love or hate, but right now another band with a big discography fills arenas and whatnot, and that's Sabaton.
I have them on my list as the filling in the role later.
Yeah,
they're huge. You look at their plays on Spotify; it's millions.
It's huge.
It's huge. Yeah,
huge. And again, here's a band that, okay, we're going to be a band with a theme, and it's going to be historical warfare and military, you know, history. Cool. No one's really done that. I mean, sure, Udo wore camo. You know,
both Thrower had, you know, a lot of songs about war,
but not a whole, like, every album is like another chapter in historical military combat or something. You know, it's crazy,
and they're
what
good
a cool
too.
Thing to come up with,
and they're good, a good band.
Yeah, excellent band.
Yep.
You know, so that's the kind of thing I'm talking about that would have to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And as much as I dislike the band, Slipknot is one of those bands. They did come up with their own thing. I don't care for it, but apparently millions of people do, you know. So
I got something kind of quick that I just thought of it, and it's an out of the box idea, right? And no one's gonna like this idea either. All right.
Folks have been agreeing with most of your points in the chat so far, Lee. Don't be so hard on yourself. You're bringing up some good stuff.
But look, I love underground metal. That's where I feel like I belong. But I do pay attention to the stuff that's bigger. This idea, actually, you guys won't like, though. I swear. All right, so I just looked it up. Ghost has 8 million Spotify listeners. That's big, right? I'm thinking in the course of Atlanta, right? So Atlanta has multiple outdoor amphitheaters, but then they have Mercedes-Benz, which is where you have the Super Bowl, place like that, right? So Mercedes-Benz acts are Beyonce, Taylor Swift, and guess who else? Post Malone. Post Malone likes metal. What have all the pop artists done in the last couple of years? They've done a country album. what if Post Malone did a metal album? That would be
He just did a country
stadium
album.
show. Yeah. So I'm just saying, like, he wouldn't be a metal artist, but it actually could come from a completely different angle than all the stuff we're talking about, and none of us would be happy about it, probably.
It's an interesting idea. That's a good point, Lee. Because Post Malone does like a lot of that
he
stuff.
listens to hardcore all the
Yeah,
time.
he's
And
a
he's
metal
brought
guy.
a lot of
Yeah.
he in particular has brought a lot of attention to other things. He's a big gaming geek.
Yeah.
He bought a Black Lotus Alpha for like $5 million or something in auction a year or two ago, and it put a huge
Magic
spotlight
Gathering?
on Wizards of the Coast and Magic the Gathering. Not because tons of more people played it, but because he plays it, and because he has shown up on some podcasts playing with the hosts of the show and showing off the card and all. And so they got a huge spike in interest from a completely different direction than you would think.
Hey,
So,
Dave.
that's a very good
Thank you.
point.
Thanks, Dave.
Dave, thank you.
Reading your comment. Hold on a second. So that's why. Right on. No, thank you so much, Dave. All right.
Well, Marty, I believe it's your turn for this one.
The more I sit and think about this, I kind of look at this whole, we're talking about who will fill in behind. I think there's an order to it. I think it's a lot like a Middle Earth, a Tolkien's world, when all the leaves fall off the tree, the elves get on the boat, and they head off to the Undying Lands. It is now time for the time of men, right? I mean, when the
This
boomer...
took a turn.
Yeah. Yeah. The boomers and the Gen Xers, that's who we kind of share bands. And, once the priests and the maidens go off, it's, the Gen X guys, their bands. It's almost like we're anchored to this in our time zone. I mean, Ghost, they kind of jumped the line a little bit. They appealed to all of us because they, borrowed from classic rock. They borrowed from, occult rock. They borrowed from a lot of things that older guys can appreciate, younger guys can appreciate, with the bells and the whistles and the stage show and the masks and the anonymity and all that stuff, and the Satanism, the satanic panic vibe. They jumped the line because they had a gimmick. Their brand sold really well, and I hate to say it, metalheads, they dig a brand. We love a good brand, the logo, the
It's all part of the package, baby.
the mascot that you've got, the belt buckle mascot, or the the blow up doll in your closet. Who knows? But
Well, what band is that, Marty? I want to
good.
see that.
Never mind.
So, Marty, when you were chanting Eddie before the show,
Don't judge me. But no, I think that when our time, new metal's going to get its time. I mean, look at Limp Bizkit now. I hate to say it, they've been packing arenas. They take out a bunch of knuckleheads, Corey Feldman, who are talentless bullshit, and that makes Limp Bizkit look even kookier, kitschy cool, and funny, and ha ha ha. And they're packing places, and that era of kids has nostalgia for that band, that era, the Corns of the world, I don't know that world that well, but it's starting now. It's starting now. Maiden and Priest are on the precipice of the Undying Lands, and what's coming up behind? Ghost, new metal. New metal's going to get its time. Five Finger Fruit Punch. I don't even know what that, but so yeah, that's kind of where my thoughts are at with that. It might not be a very eloquent answer, but it kind of seems right to me. I mean, no matter where you jump in at music, that's your anchor. It just is. I mean, like we have Logan on. He loves like the stoner sludge stuff. That's kind of where he connected, and he's always going to follow that. That's going to follow him through his whole life. It just is.
That's what connected.
It's what connects us all, and that's why the bands that when they're gone, we're not going to stop liking metal. We're still going to listen to those bands. We're just not. I've only seen Maiden once in my life. It was great, but I was never. I can't really say I'll miss them playing live because I've only seen them once. I've always missed them live. You know what I mean? Priest. I've never seen Priest. I can't say I'll miss them in the live arena because I've never seen Priest live, and now it's not going to happen. It just isn't going to happen. So, kind of my thoughts on that.
Are you all connected to the idea of a heavy metal band being in a stadium?
It's
I don't
weird, but
love
it's. I mean, Maiden. You can't Metallica. Look at some of the soccer stadiums those guys are playing. It's ridiculous. It's huge, and they're so. You flip through the satellite radio, and they're on like dad rock stations. They are, and I'm thinking, and that's such a mind fuck to think that a band that I used to see as such superior thrashers are like these old farts up there smoking the stogies and wearing $10,000 sparkly coats and all this bullshit that Kirk Hammett does, and they go out and pack these arenas on the basis of their first 5 albums.
Right. Like, I mean, Lee, have you ever seen a band that you personally identified with or grew up around in a major stadium venue?
Well, I did see Slipknot in the stadium. Yeah. And I mean, I grew up with them. Yeah. So, I mean, I've been listening to Slipknot since I was probably 11. So, yeah, that would probably be the closest. And that was purely just out of nostalgia. I only really have caught up with the first 3 albums.
See, and that goes back to what I was saying. Is metal leaving the arena format?
It's about to.
Yeah.
I think
it left a while ago. I mean, to be perfectly honest, like when the most important art was being done in the 90s, I think it left the stadium. I think if you look at that time period in heavy metal's history, there was incredibly important heavy metal records being made in the 1990s. It just didn't belong in a 100,000 venue in Rio. You know what I mean? Like it just, that wasn't it. And those records are all classics. They've been around for 30 plus years. But I just don't think it ever belonged. Like it died in that sort of setting for me. And I never experienced it. And so I think we're trying to like shoehorn this idea of what heavy metal is into a concept that died 40 years ago.
Know more about what a legacy band is, not necessarily metal, the genre, but what a legacy metal act is. I think it's more kind of what the idea was. And it's an interesting discussion, because I could not imagine nowadays seeing Maiden in a smaller venue, because that's just not what they are now. Right. But when I was 11 and I was spinning Killers, I never would have thought that band would still be going in 2024 and be as big as they are. You know, to me, that was, you know, for a long time, being a few select friends, that was our band. You know, the Maiden was underground then. You know, I mean, it was, you know, special and whatnot. And there's many metal bands I've seen in small venues that those are the special shows. You know, those are the intimate special shows. But to imagine just no metal shows being in an arena complex, and just, it's kind of mind-blowing. But I think we're getting there.
Devin kind of makes a good point here. He says, when I saw Maiden, it was the San Bernardino Amphitheater and capacity is 65,000, but probably only like half full. I mean, that's the reality between America and overseas or South America. I mean, you look at, you know, Halloween, for example, they pack places down in South America and in parts of Europe. U.S., not so much. I saw them in a 1,700 capacity theater in Michigan, Royal Oak Music Theater, and it was half full. But they played a big show in Canada the night before, crossed the bridge, came to Detroit, and then they played Chicago the night after. So they did a lot of shows in a very small radius. So that probably impacted the Detroit show considerably. But metal in the U.S. has always been the underdog. It just is. There's some bands like Metallica will pack the place because they have some weird crossover potential. That Black album, it elevated them into a position that the likes metal has never seen. It just is. Anyway, Alan, I think it's your turn. Sorry, we got all sorts of sidetracked there. It was all good though.
Oh no,
all
again,
good.
We're not trying to stay on track.
No,
round table means we go, around and touch on things. That's fine. No, folks have made some good points, so I'll try to follow up on things I remember. I absolutely agree with Lee that heavy metal is going to continue to drift, into a more extreme direction. And Marty, I agree with you. That does put a cap on your audience size. That when you're trying to push the extremity envelope, that's only going to appeal to a certain subset of society. It's only going to have, it can only have so much mainstream appeal if that's the angle you're taking. I do, however, disagree about there being a cap to extremity. I think bands will just find different ways to be more extreme. I mean, we've seen that somewhat already through the 21st century with metal bands being much more percussive focused than they were in the 80s and 90s when they were maybe much more guitar focused or much more synthesizer focused. So they'll find other ways, to be extreme. Part of that may also just be in terms of the packaging. Someone made the point earlier, Kellen, it may have been you, that the leather and bullet belt look may not impress or scare a 10-year-old anymore, but they'll find some other visual that will get that kind of reaction to draw in the shock and awe, because like you said too, Marty, metal fans, people, they love a gimmick, and that will absolutely, they'll find other kind of extreme gimmicks. Yes, Cannibal Corpse's shtick may become tame. People then will just find something else that will cause that same kind of outrage and uproar, which will immediately attract a young audience. Because
look at Watain. Watain had this big, the blood, we don't wash our clothes, we smell like ass, we dump real blood on the crowd. Ooh, everybody's all Watain. No one gives a shit about Watain because it's done. The shtick is done.
But sticks do come and go.
Yeah.
Corpse paint used to be cool, and that was kind of dark when it first came out. Now it's almost laughable. You gotta be really careful if you're going to do that.
Yeah. Now it's just kind of like, yeah, sure, you wear it.
Yeah, you better have the stuff to back it up, I guess.
But yeah, the right shtick can still work, though. I mean, Ghost, part of what got them popular was the whole zombie Pope costume thing. And that's something, there are certain themes you can always poke at to get a good reaction. Poking at religion is always kind of a safe bet to, help get a whole lot of eyeballs turned your way. Even if you're not very serious about it, you don't have to be dedicated Satanists and burning down churches. You just got to dress up like some kind of dead pope and kind of, pantomime. I think, Duane said, whether they're serious about it or not, it got the right reaction for that band.
Alice Cooper. They're just like the Alice Cooper of their generation,
Yeah, it's just, vaudeville in a way. But
Man
it's the vaudeville
War,
that will get...
Saint,
Mm-hmm.
So there's a good point, Alan, that you just brought up with this. Is what are those power metal bands now? What's the one where they come out in the armor and the weapons and what? Like
there's a bunch of them, yes, and that's that's the kind of I joke about it and Marty listens to it. That is kind of the new extreme direction for power metal to go into, is to add this visual aspect to get the eyeballs on them. That just getting up there in jeans and leather jackets, whatever, that's been done.
They might be Marvel
getting up there in
superheroes.
a cape with a giant hammer and your elf ears pointing towards Odin. That gets attention to you. I can make it sound silly, but as Marty said, not that Sabaton does the costume thing, but those kind of bands are the ones getting the attention, and a big part of the reason they're getting the attention is they're pushing power metal into this kind of, I would consider it a silly extreme, but for other people, it's like it's great, they love it, and so the numbers
it's all
don't lie.
pop. It's metal pop music, and that's
my
easy to
other
digest.
point. Yes, that's my other point. For these bands. For metal in the future, part of it is, to grow to become one of these, superstar level bands. Your music does still have to have a certain accessibility. You're never going to have, a flat out cavernous death metal, band with, Neanderthal growls. They're just never going to have that much mainstream access. You're never going to get some, ultra complex, Norwegian black metal, post-metal weirdness band sell out, on these kind of levels, because the music is too intense, too complex, just too out there. The bands, some of the ones we've been talking about, Sabaton, Gojira, Angus McSix, some of the ones that, Duane just brought up, their music, is still has, it's catchy and, quote unquote poppy enough to draw in a bigger and bigger and bigger audience. And, that's part of what's necessary if you're going to have your band rise to that level. I'm not claiming those bands are necessarily out to achieve
Glory
world
Hammer,
domination.
that's-
Glory Hammer being the
That's
the
the one I was
Angus
thinking
McSix
of,
one.
yeah.
So yeah, but yeah,
Okay.
it will be a limit on it. As far as the stadium thing goes too, Kellen's right. There was a time and a place where that was a thing. And I didn't mean for us to stick to that literal image that a band must still do that. Just that I wanted to focus on the types of bands who have been capable of doing that. But
They got
another
to that
factor,
level.
that got to that level when that level was part of was culturally pertinent. Because I don't know if metal can get back to that size or not. It doesn't need to. One aspect we haven't talked about, Duane mentioned people just not really getting back into concert attendance after COVID. Another aspect is the cost of going to concerts in this day and age.
Amen.
Yep.
Amen.
A lot
Oh
of them
my
you look at
God.
it, it's just like, that would be a cool show to go to. I'm not paying, $200 to go see that. I mean, I looked at going to see, who was it? Venom Incorporated and Satan at a place like an hour from here. I think it was last year. Yeah, I quickly did the math. Gas plus the ticket and a couple of beers and a t-shirt, it's going to be like over $100 to see Venom Incorporated when Jeff wasn't even touring with
That's a
them, because
deal.
there were health reasons he wasn't. But to see no original Venom members plus Brian Ross and Satan was going to be over $100 night out for just me, and I'm going by myself, which isn't a whole lot of fun going to concerts with no one anyway.
I love Rammstein.
And it's just like, shit, do I want to spend that much on that particular concert experience? And then you scale it up from there. I know people who have gone to see Queensryche or Priest in recent years, and they've had to spend, $200, $300, $400 for a decent ticket where they're not in a nosebleed. There's only so many people that can do that. So yeah, the idea of, the stadium thing's got a real cap on it. To talk on some bands that maybe could fill that void. And, yes, these are bands I'm not hugely familiar with, but I feel like they maybe have enough of a buzz about them. They've built up enough of a following. Someone mentioned it in the chat earlier. It may have been Jack Half a Prayer. We haven't brought it up, but about a month ago, Gojira was playing the opening ceremony of the Olympics in front of, like 1 billion people watching on TV or something. I don't know much about Gojira. I'm not going to say I like them or dislike
I own
them.
one
really
CD.
Don't know them.
It's pretty good.
I've heard a few songs here and there. I've just never really followed up on them. But the fact that, they're on that, the fact that they even somehow, I mean, I don't know how they got, that particular gig. The fact that they did definitely implies something about their popularity. They weren't, the frickin' Olympics doesn't just, pick any random local bar band to fill
They're
out
probably the
roster.
biggest, one of the biggest bands in France, I would imagine, that weren't, I don't know.
Mhm.
It's weird. It's a weird.
But yeah, they were deemed relevant enough to appear on a global stage for one of the biggest global events that occurs. That's a thing.
Can you imagine
Kellen's
if
excited. Kellen's excited. He's got something.
Well, can we? So this, as soon as
Go ahead.
Alan mentioned that he previously in the sort of our email thread, the first thing I thought, the Olympics in 2028 is going to be in Los Angeles, right?
Yep.
So, I mean, I don't know if any of you are aware of that or care. From
Don't
someone
care.
Neither.
Okay. Everyone's like absolutely dead silent. Like, we do not care, Kellen. We do not pay attention to sports.
my wife
Okay.
does? My wife loves
Okay.
it. Yeah.
But and I just when he mentioned that, the first thing I thought was, who's the LA band? Like, who's if we had to pull a California
Rat.
heavy metal band to open the
No. It's
we're
Crew,
all Americans
man.
here. We're all Americans here. So like if you had to do that, I'm just thinking of a band that from that area. It's not like there's a lack of heavy metal bands from California, but if we were forced right now to pick a band from that, like who would be our attempt to throw in there? So
who doesn't want to see Vince Neil stumble through the words to the Star Spangled Banner?
I mean, realistically, it has to be Metallica. In my
Right,
opinion.
but I think if we were to remove, right, like, because I think in the premise of the question is like a future legacy band, right? Gojira, in my mind, is like a 2000s band, right?
Okay.
Mars the Sirius is probably their best known record.
That's the
from
one I have
2000.
with
Yeah.
the whales on it.
Yeah. I think from 2005. That was kind of the record that broke them in my mind. I could be wrong, so the chat could correct me there, but so
A consistent band.
Yeah, I was going to say to Alan's point though, it's a younger band, and the fact that they have that kind of sort of legitimacy, I think I was just hard pressed to think of a current Los Angeles band that you could sort of impose in that scenario and it would make sense by any means.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but yeah, it would make sense. Yeah, if they did it. California, I'm not sure who else, but that's a good thought process, Kellen. Folks have talked Ghost. Ghost, I think, sort of fits the bill, except I don't know, are Ghosts still operating in a heavy metal realm, or have they kind of drifted just more into a rock realm at this point? I don't know, because I don't keep up with the band.
I would say every album has gotten further away. I mean, it's I don't.
They're
It's
hard
gotten
to
lighter.
place.
I will say it's gotten lighter, but also catchier. So, you know.
Chad kind of answered that LA question. It would probably be the Foo Fighters, I would guess.
Oh, that's a good pick. Yeah.
Yeah, Foo Fighters would be an undeniable Olympics band
Olympic
for sure.
caliber thing. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, I could definitely see Ghost. Folks have brought up Opeth in the chat, and Opeth's an interesting one. I mean, they have. It feels like they could be. On the other hand, at least for big parts of their catalog, I wonder if it's just not quite accessible enough, to a more, to a much broader audience. Opeth are known for being, very intricate musicians, long songs with multiple parts and, big tempo changes.
But the numbers just aren't there. Opeth is the pinnacle of like a very successful cult band. They have very loyal fans that buy their tickets, that buy their CDs, that buy everything. So like I think they make good money, but they are not. They're even Mastodon and Gojira have better numbers than
like Mastodon.
Opeth.
Yeah.
That was kind of what I was thinking too, Lee. That I kind of feel like Opeth doesn't quite. Opeth's just not built to quite crack that barrier the same way. That yes, they'll always have a die-hard fan base and a pretty big one.
Yeah,
but not on the kind of scale we're thinking of here. There are other new bands too, and I have no idea on numbers on this. Maybe Lee can check them real quick, but just bands that I've heard now have several years worth of push on things like Liquid Metal on Sirius XM and similar outlets. There are bands like Ginger and Spirit Box. These bands seem to have a lot of appeal. Yeah, they seem to be very big. I don't really know their music very well, other than the couple of songs I hear, on my commute back and forth when I'm listening to the radio. And those are bands that are also kind of taking the metal in a little different direction. They're still very extreme sounding, but not in a death metal way. Not in a they're not focusing on just the traditional death metal or black metal elements to be extreme. So I don't know if they're too extreme to become widely popular, or maybe they've got the right balance to be the next big thing.
I think
Lee, do you have some insights on those kind of bands?
Well, so Spirit Box, and we're just for simplicity, like Spotify listeners aren't everything. I get that.
Of course.
Just for a quick search, Spirit Box, a little over 2 million. So they're around Gojira in terms of size. And that makes sense because they're actually coming to Atlanta with Korn and Gojira next week in Atlanta, I think.
Okay.
Korn being the headliner. Ginger is only 700,000, so they're actually quite a bit smaller.
I think smaller than that.
Yeah. Okay. But the other thing too with some of the newer bands, and let's be also clear, Slipknot isn't a new band. They're 25 years old. Mm-hmm. They had that Y2K era where CD sales were still very relevant. The bands that are coming out now and getting a lot of buzz, they have the disadvantage of an album being a fleeting thing. An album isn't like a giant, stamp. People only just really know the singles, and people are not buying their records nearly as much.
There's been a big talk of like how releasing albums anymore is kind of stupid because people release 4 good singles.
Yeah.
Type of thing. That just seems insane. Talk about going against the system, I don't know. I mean interrupt you, Lee. Sorry.
Oh, I think there will be, especially with just how TikTok works and stuff, there will be fad bands that blow up and then dissipate very rapidly. That's not a legacy. So that's also kind of like a false alarm to be aware of in the next 20 years, that just because a band's really big, they could literally deflate in the next year very dramatically.
That's a very good point. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that kind of relates to Duane's thing. The last point I'll make is, Duane mentioned that things tend to go in cycles, and he's absolutely right. With the cycling, like some folks have been, we've been talking about like new metal, Limp Bizkit becoming big and blown up again. And yes, they're getting a lot more attention here in the past year or so, but I think that's just part of that 30-year cycle where, 10 years ago, we were all in that kind of, middle-aged group that has your midlife crisis, and you start clinging to all the stuff, from that you enjoyed as a kid. We're kind of drifting out of that phase a little bit right now. And now it's the millennial kids, who were all, when they were 14 years old, Korn and Limp Bizkit, that was their introduction to heavy music. Those were their bands. Well, now they're old enough to, be getting into the 40s, and they're having their nostalgic wave. We saw it several years ago with, all the, glam bands coming back. You go back to the early 2000s, Def Leppard was lucky to play a Walmart parking lot. You jump forward 10 years and they were back on the road big again. But with those kind of styles, they also then rotate back out. I don't think nu metal is the future of heavy metal. I don't think glam metal is the future of heavy metal. And like we've talked about, conventional death metal is probably not the future of heavy metal either.
No.
Those styles have become popular again. They've gone through that cycle that Duane
Cyclical.
described.
Yep.
But they're going to rotate back out, and other things will eventually take their place. So yeah, I'm not the least bit worried that, Fred Durst becomes, the face of heavy metal for the next 20 years. He may be, a big touring force for the next 5 to 10 years. And then everybody will get tired of that again, and the next generation won't be as interested. So yeah, I think, there are some bands that have the potential to be quite big. I don't know if we really get back to, yes, those gigantic kind of tours and things. That may have been, yes, just a moment in time that, the pop culture of the 80s, for lots of reasons, all coalesced and allowed that to happen. But it doesn't have to happen either. It doesn't mean bands won't be successful, have a good long career. Just factors like you said, Lee, with record sales not being a thing, that may limit some things. Costs of going to concerts may limit things. The fact that so many different styles of music are so easily accessible now that when we were growing up, you tended to gravitate to something and you just stuck to it. But sorry, I missed whatever popped up.
It's time for Corey Feldman to reign supreme.
In that case, the end days have arrived. But like in our days, you found your thing, you liked it, you stuck to it. And in a lot of cases, maybe there were other things you would have liked that you just never got exposed to. Well, now, if some kid is curious about heavy metal, they can type it into YouTube and explore it for a week or two. And if the next day someone mentions like, oh, goth stuff, they can immediately access that. I could never have accessed goth music growing up. That nobody I knew listened to it. There was no exposure route. And that may make it harder for any particular style to blow up from beyond an underground scene. That the interest gets spread out a lot more than it used to. That you're not going to have a fan base that is all heavy metal, just heavy metal, nothing but heavy metal long term. It's like, yeah, I like a lot of heavy metal, but damn, this death country double bass, it absolutely slaps, and they're big into that. And so their interest kind of gets spread out, and that will limit how much mobility bands have to become huge if people are, again, only, like we said earlier, they become more of the casual fans with a wide set of interests rather than a legion of pure 100% headbangers who are not paying attention to anything else. There's just too much media attracting people's attention for them to ignore everything else the way that maybe we ignored a lot of stuff when we were younger and didn't have those media outlets pushing on us. So that's my take. Sorry for rambling a little.
Kellen, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, what was the first thing that came to mind? We've been talking a lot about Ghost, in a band that I would be much more comfortable sort of promoting and putting in this place as a, by comparison, even though the numbers don't support it, I think make more sense for me is like a band like Tribulation. Like that band, I think they actually went out on tour with Ghost as a supporting act. And looking at their career, starting as a bit more of an aggressive sort of like thrash death band, and how they've moved in sort of this goth death thing now. Like when you brought this to me, I kept on trying to look for some sort of compromise as to, I'm not just looking at what sort of data is approaching, who's going to fill a stadium, but also like where I think the future can go, because the art itself has greater credibility in heavy metal circles. Like, I think that's sort of the next part of the question is like, even though we're kind of looking this, pulling up our Spotify numbers, because that's the first thing I did. I'm looking for some sort of metric for today. To what came sort of interesting is we brought up, Duane's talked about sort of this legacy concept and things sort of reappearing in time, trying to, guess in 25 years what still will have currency. It will probably be music that is today maybe not as popular, but will have greater sort of credibility. So like the first thing that came to mind is like what American power metal is today. Some of the bands I'm going to sort of talk about, if you had told me told anyone in 1983 or 1984 that Manila Road would have a level of visibility and currency in the 2025 that they do today, probably no one would have believed you.
Right.
But that kind of
right. Even the band themselves probably. Yeah.
Right. And so the idea, like, one, because it was great music and it wouldn't appear on whatever, it wouldn't fill the stadium in 1984. It definitely, if that's our metric today is looking at Spotify numbers, it definitely would have been on Spotify, but it reemerges 40 years later because it's good heavy metal music. And I think that's kind of going to be where we sort of turn to the next sort of, or pivot, if you will, to the next part of our question is, where's that today? Do you feel something that's not as necessarily popular, that's not filling stadiums, but in the decades to come will resurface as credible, legitimate heavy metal records?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that is a good way to kind of transition, Kellen, if we want to. But before we start, talking about future important albums, did anybody want to follow up on anything else that's come up?
I have one thought, just from what I've been hearing over the past 10 minutes or so, and that's that I think a lot of it comes down to the way in the 80s and even in the early part of the 90s, for sure in the 70s and prior, the way they digested music is completely different than the way it is now. The accessibility is completely different. When I was in high school and I bought a cassette tape or an album, I lived with that album for a month.
Even if I hated it.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. It was like you were forced to absorb it.
Yep. I shoveled so much dog shit for this tape. I'm going to listen to it. Sometimes my mind changed. Sometimes it did not.
And all that shit ended up on the tape because it's terrible.
Yeah. And like you say, Marty, even if you hated it, you still built a relationship with this album.
You did.
Right? So now, I can set my computer tonight and get up tomorrow morning and have downloaded an instant metal collection, right, of MP3s or whatnot that would, fill us a small portable drive, right, instantly.
Yep.
And you know what? I may listen to a few of those, and the others may sit there for years before I even think of playing them.
Yep.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So the way that music is digested now, it has to be sold a lot stronger now to get noticed than I think it used to be. So, as well as just the options. I mean, there's so many options and bands out there now. Perfect example is actually Satan and Blitzkrieg. I was kind of late to those bands. It wasn't until I got through all the other bands that that finally it's like, I I kind of saw these guys. What are they all about? Now I love those. Anything Ross does is just phenomenal. And that kind of leads me to the Manila Road thing. Personally, if you were to ask me on the street without time to think, would you rather see Manila Road at a Coliseum event, or would you rather see him at a small pub in, Bristol? I want a small pub. I want Manila Road to myself, man.
I only saw them once, and they were great. Fantastic live.
But then again, probably they wouldn't want nothing more than to fill a Coliseum, So I think the way that it's almost, I would say, I kind of in a way feel sorry for every new generation that comes on board getting into music, because you almost have so many forks in the road, so many options, so many, you have to really, it's going to be harder to find your self.
And the past is alive. I mean, I think the past is just as relevant today. Of course, this is an old guy saying this, but I think the past contributes so much to what's happening now in metal that you can't just skip over it. Because if you do, you're performing a disservice to yourself. I mean, you're missing some classics that still to this day sound just as relevant as they did the day they came out, in my opinion.
Yeah, there's some stuff that, back in 1989, I used to make fun of. And now I actually love that stuff.
Yeah.
How many people have come around to Turbo, like Judas Priest?
Well, that was the only Judas Priest album I had back when I was a kid, was Turbo. So I have a connection with that one. Yeah.
That album was banished.
It was terrible, but still has some good stuff on it.
Yeah. Oh, totally. But it's I think the way music was digested then has a large effect on those bands and metal, especially back then, because you had to purchase it, and because you purchased it, you gave it a lot more attention, and it wasn't at your fingertips like it is now. You had to make the money, you had to get in the car or on the bus or on the skateboard to go down to retrieve the item, and then you had to bring it all the way back home, and that's if you could afford the stereo to play it on at the time. And all this stuff has to mold perfectly in order for you to enjoy or try to enjoy this particular album. And now, hell, man, I'm in 7 clicks and I'm there,
Yeah.
It just doesn't have that same attachment feeling, that same relationship that we used to have to build with our music.
At the same time, though, what are we doing right now? We have, 100 people all talking about albums we're passionate about. So there's a benefit to today, too. It just takes focus and discipline, in terms of your listening habits and where you want to spend your time.
Yep, absolutely.
Good point, Lee. Let's see.
Glass half full.
There you go. I gotta go let my dogs out real quick, guys. I'll be right back.
Right on.
No problem. Yep. Marty, did you have anything you want to follow up with?
No, this was the what bands fill the role. What we thought would fill the role. I mean,
right. Yes. Yeah.
I had a hard time making the list because, again, this is just a realm that I'm not familiar with. So I tried to come up with bands that I like and I perceive as being big. Sabaton was on the list. I like Sabaton, and their Spotify listeners. I think they're over 1 million. They got a bunch of listeners. I'm not a huge fan of Rammstein, and I don't know how much longer they're going to be around, but they're obviously filling stadiums. Their stage antics with the fire and stuff is pretty impressive. It's just hard. I mean, I wrote Dream Theater on this list, knowing full well that they're probably too proggy to appeal to a humongous audience, but they do walk the line between melody and pretentiousness just right. I mean, they definitely have a huge fan base. I think they're kind of a musician's band type of band.
Yeah.
But, I mean, they've got the clean vocals. They've got a lot of checks and the balances, a lot of checks in their column that could propel them to bigger, getting out of the theaters into bigger stages. Ghost, of course. Gojira I put down there. I put Halloween on the list because, I've seen their output around the world. They're packing places all over the world. But again, a lot of those guys are in their 60s. They're getting old. They're not going to be, they're just a decade behind the priests and the maidens. You know, they're nipping at their heels.
Right. Like, I was thinking because the two bands that came to mind for me that were also 80s bands but are still putting out new material were Candlemass and Kirathunkel. They have, I know they're coming to an end in terms of like performing live. Like to me, okay, I would if Candlemass were to come together, and they seem like a big band that everyone could gather, but I don't know if they're popular enough. Right?
I don't see them as a stadium band.
Yeah,
I
they're
just
not
don't.
a stadium band,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of other bands from the 1980s that would be part of that circuit, that would have played live enough, that would have had the decades of run up to be a headliner at a major venue with an incredibly important metal catalog. But I don't think they're that on that level at all.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the big four bands, they're all in the conversation, but they're at the end as far as I shouldn't say they're at the end. I would say they're 10, 20 years away from being done. That's 20 years might be a bit gracious, but Lamb of God, another band that's big. They've gone on a lot of huge tours over the years.
That's a good one to call. Yeah.
Megadeth, of course, they're with Metallica and Anthrax and all those bands. Blind Guardian made my list. Again, old dudes, overseas. They're big here. They play smaller places, but they
Not
play
enough
music.
elf ears.
Not enough elf ears. Maybe they could tour with Twilight Force and share
Borrow their
wardrobe.
capes.
Yeah, borrow their capes. Opeth, we already discussed that. I agree with it. In Flames was another one. I just kind of lost interest in that band, but it seems like they kept growing. Mastodon and death metal. You gotta nod an appreciation of Cannibal Corpse. You just do. I think they're the AC/DC of death metal. They're good. They're awesome. They haven't stopped. I think the biggest selling death metal albums were Morbid Angel albums, but obviously Morbid Angel is just a fraction of what it once was. So this is a list I just threw together, and I'm just like, I don't know how excited I am about any of these choices because I just don't see it being like arena, like, you know, Maiden or Metallica level. But anyway,
Do you think Carcass, as they exist today, could do that?
no.
No. Okay.
Not with the
Lamb of God's an interesting
Completely
one to
like trying to
call.
check it out.
Oh, I don't think so. I think they're a popular band, 100%, but I just don't see that type of humor, lyrical content, and vocals are going to go into that realm well. They're always going to be a theater or a slightly larger, in between a theater and arena size, you know, festivals. Anybody else have any bands they want to throw out there before we move on?
You know, I would say, because it was brought up in the chat a few times, and I actually honestly agree with it. Even though it's a different kind of metal, it's an industrial metal, but Rammstein is, you know, there's an arena packing band at high price and sells out, and, you know, they're definitely a legacy level band for sure.
Thomas here mentioned Amon Amarth. That they're worth throwing in the conversation as well, as far as death metal goes, for sure.
I don't consider Tool necessarily a metal band, but if you did, they would be for sure arena. They sell a ton of tickets, but they're really not metal in my opinion.
Yeah, they're always kind of metal adjacent though, Lee. That's a good one to bring up.
Right.
Yeah.
Maze mentioned them.
All right.
All right. Well, then let's see. I believe, our kind of, third and last segment here for this topic was that, we wanted to try to each pull a few albums that we think in the future, and we just, went with 2050 as a benchmark. And like folks have said, there's no way to predict the future. Heavy metal may not even exist. Nobody may care about it at all. Or it could be the biggest thing on the planet by then. But, the idea was to try to, pick, 5 albums each, since there's more of us tonight. We'll just pick like 5 that we think are going to withstand the test of time. That, if you were to talk to people, in 20, 25 years time, they would say like, oh yeah, that's a monster heavy metal album. That's a classic heavy metal album. That it's still viewed that way, if it's a classic today.
Mandatory.
Some of us may have interpreted this as, newer albums that are going to be considered that way. We each may have interpreted that a little bit differently, and that's fine. But yeah, the idea is, what albums are really going to withstand the test of time? Because not all of them are. It's very easy for us all to sit here tonight and throw up the horns and be like, metal will never die, bro. Maybe it
like
does,
Willie
maybe
K
it
just
doesn't.
did.
Yeah. It might do well. It might
Good job,
not.
Willie.
I come at this from a different point of view, because I've watched my dad, who's been a big record collector for 60 years. He started collecting records in the 60s, and he was collecting all the stuff, the 50s and 60s material, mostly the pre-British invasion stuff. Thinking Elvis and Chuck Berry, that generation. And that stuff, was extremely popular for a long time. Elvis was the biggest celebrity on this planet, through the 60s and 70s, and even in long after his death. But today, Elvis isn't much of a thing. Graceland has financial trouble, and when's the last time you met anybody who was a diehard Elvis fan or an
The
Elvis
fan base
collector?
is dying. They're gone.
That fan base has kind of, like we talked about with these cycles, that one has kind of cycled out. And, if you had said, in the late 70s or early 80s that, oh, yeah, 20 years, 30 years from now, no one's going to care about Elvis, that would have been heresy. Everybody would have thought you were insane. Like, no, Elvis will be forever. Well, here we are 40 years later, and Elvis is an afterthought. Not all heavy metal, may survive the test of time. So that's kind of the point here. Is what do we think is going to be, those big classic, well-respected, well-loved albums in the future? The albums everybody says, these are the 10 albums you've got to hear. These are the albums that the Decibel is doing their Hall of Fame 2050 edition on, and putting these albums still up there as being the benchmarks. So, and again, if we all interpreted it slightly different, that's absolutely fine. But let's go back to the head of the batting order and start with Lee on this. Lee,
I'll be right back, guys.
Hit us, Lee.
So I have some overall thoughts. I think we've hit some of them, but I just wanted to explain some of the generational stuff.
Sure.
Once more. So in 2050, I'm going to be 58, and the oldest millennials are going to be 69.
Mm-hmm.
Gen Z folks will be anywhere between 38 to 52, and Gen Alpha will be 25 to late 30s, so they'll be around where my age is. The other thing to consider is the most important years in musical development, or where your tastes are formed, are teenage years. So, for millennials, the key years, in most cases, were 2002 to 2015. For Gen Z, key years would be 2010 to 2026. And then for Gen Alpha, those key years haven't happened yet. So I just want to put that out there, because there will be a lot of albums that are going to stand the test of time, but every generation naturally is going to want to include something from their generation into these lists. That's
Sure.
just going to happen. So that being said, I think the first one that in 2050 will be considered one of the best will be Metallica Black Album. Now, for each pick, if it's okay, I have what I think will be it, and then what I would prefer to be it. Okay? So this would be my pick if I had the power to, but what I realistically think will be Black Album.
I had the same, Lee.
Yeah. 30 million sold. This thing is ginormous. And I also think that in terms of the bigger bands now, this would be more influential. Big choruses, anthemic production, mid-paced sound. I mean, we know these songs whether we like it or not, but I do think this will be one of the 5 that I would pick to be a sure thing to be a classic album in 2050.
And you got to say I think the main driving force for why that album was so big and remains big this day is because it was ramrodded down our throats by MTV. Every single single you listen to that album, it's shocking how many singles there were off of it.
It's amazing.
And they had videos for it, and they were on MTV all hours of the day and night. And that's just what people checked in with to get music from them back then.
That's the album that made your grandma go, I know who Metallica is. That's the album that did that. So.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's an excellent first pick, Lee, for sure.
Are we just going to go in a circle on this, or? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
That sounds good. So, Kellen, what's the first one you want to mention?
So I approached this I think I'm happy that Lee started with like a generational sort of analysis of like different sort of years. I approached this for my perspective of prior generations that I still think will be relevant and important, and then trying to go through today, meaning something that's come out more recently that, you know, in 25 years will be important.
Sure.
So, my first record that I think is already now the sort of the Decibel Hall of Fame thing was my thought. So it may not be a big seller or anything like that, but it does have still more to offer metal fans in 2050, just as much as it did when it first came out. This is kind of how I'm approaching that.
Okay.
So my first choice here is Fate's Warning, Waken the Guardian.
You bastard.
So
good thing I had more than 5, so this is fine. That's good.
So the rationale here for me was there are a lot of younger bands who are pulling from this era of American heavy metal right now. Very few, I think, use this band as source material and this album specifically. There's a lot of bands who are doing sort of traditional epic kind of stuff. Few touch like the nuances of this album. So if you were to ask me to name a band that comes close to this, in more recent years, and this specific record, I think I have a difficult time naming it. I think in still 25 years from now, people will be pulling from this, trying to dig into its sort of intricacies and what makes it unique and its atmospheric and mystery. So because it's been so difficult to sort of penetrate this and pull out what makes it special, I still think in the next few decades, it'll have a lot to offer younger bands, and fans will return to it, trying to find what made it so unique to begin with.
Good pick.
Mm-hmm.
Duane.
Yeah, okay, so the way I went about this was I tried to look at bands that are still currently active and that are of legacy level and have an album that will be in 2050 still looked back upon as like mandatory. Like I said, mandatory metal, I guess, or yeah, the whole Decibel, like, you know, Hall of Fame thing. And I know, especially with Marty, me, and Alan, there's definitely probably going to end up being some crossovers here. But
I picked some weird shit. I don't know. I'm
Okay.
still confused by my picks, but anyway, go ahead.
Well, this beautiful sumbitch turns 40 years old tomorrow. It turns 40, and that is Don't Break the Oath by Merciful Fate.
Eternal classic.
This album right here is the start of so many things, as well as scaring the shit out of every little metalhead that got inducted to it. This album made metal scary, or this band actually.
Yep.
But this was my introduction. Was this band, this album, and to this day, it's still my favorite. The only argument that could really be put to that would be Venom. But Venom, to me, almost has a more of a comedic tone to it, where King made it more like you swear King Diamond was sacrificing chickens every night, you know, to Satan. That's just what I believed. That dude was just living it. You know, he was doing talk shows saying that, you know, no, I don't just sing about Satan. I won't, no. So,
playing the media. Yep.
Yeah. So, not to mention one of the best album covers ever designed, and
yeah.
Definitely.
I just see this for sure in the Hall of Fame in 2050 as still mandatory metal. So,
All right, Alan, what are your thoughts on your first one?
For mine, tend to have a little. They go in one of two directions. The primary direction, though, is I think the albums that will be still kind of hailed and loved more in those kind of decades down the road. It's going to be stuff that gravitates more towards the extreme side of metal. And folks may disagree with me, and that's okay. I seriously have my doubts about how popular things like, again, Priest and Maiden, that style of metal, is going to be that far down the road. We already see a generation coming up that calls it dad rock, which is not meant as a compliment. They're a bit dismissive of it as not being heavy enough. As Lee said earlier, there's always this kind of trend. The trend is towards being more extreme, and so the old stuff is less extreme and not as interesting. And while we all can kind of scoff at it and say kids these days, we did the same thing too. We did it to Deep Purple, and we did it to Led Zeppelin. Those were the heavy metal bands in the 1970s. And when we were growing up in the 80s, we didn't want to listen to Daddy's dinosaur rock. We didn't call it heavy metal. We called it dinosaur rock, implying that it was slow and stupid and plodding, and it wasn't heavy enough for us when we were cutting our teeth on Metallica and Accept and the real heavy metal. We took that term and we redefined it out from under all the fans from the 1970s. And now the same thing is happening to fans of 80s metal. Judas Priest and heavy metal to us is the quintessential heavy metal. And to Generation Z, it's dad rock. Not heavy enough. Yawn. So I don't know how much some of those types of albums are going to retain their popularity that far down the road. So I didn't pick any of that kind of stuff. I drifted a lot of my choices towards more heavy stuff. And so my first one, with all that preface out of the way, is Slayer's Reign in Blood. This is, even now still considered, a benchmark of extremity for thrash metal, leaning toward, and very influential with death metal. Aesthetics and stuff cross over into black metal. It's, a short, rabid album. It's for many Slayer fans, it's the peak of their career. This, after this, they had to kind of back off. They almost had to back off. They couldn't find a way to keep outpacing and out intensifying this. So this is the kind of album I think that in the future people would still look back and be like, yeah, that's still a badass heavy metal record. Rain in fucking Blood, man. Angel of Death and that stuff. This, I think, has a chance to still hang with whatever comes out moving forward into the future, and thus still be looked back on and be like, yeah, we're not interested in, Peace of Mind, yawn. But this, now there were some heavy bands back then, like Slayer, not Maiden or Priest. So that's why I picked Rain in Blood as my first example of an album that I think will still be considered, sort of, the essential albums that, headbangers would have to listen to. If you're going to get into metal in 2040, 2050, you still have to know Rain in Blood.
Agreed. That was very close to being on my list. I'm with you on that.
Cool. I'm with you on your first pick too. We'll circle back to that one, Lee. Marty, what you got for your first one? Sounds like somebody scooped you a little bit.
Oh no, I will. I'm looking at this list of stuff. I try to take it from a point of what did the band or this album influence going forward. And a lot of the bands I picked influenced a lot. I will say I'm with Kellen on this one here. I think this one should be remembered in 2050 for the way it makes you feel. There's an emotional component to this material that is sadly absent on a lot of metal. I mean, I don't want an emotional component on Rain and Blood. I like the hack and slash feel of it. I like the way it makes me feel at the end of it, just full of rage and fist pumping fury. This, on the other hand, this takes me to another world. not a lot of music can do that. I like the escapism in my heavy metal, and this is one of these albums that it's very emotional and very atmospheric, and it gets me there. But I look at this album and I kind of laugh because this is just kind of a ridiculous pick. But From Enslavement to Obliteration by Napalm Death. Why did you pick this thing? Well, think about it. This is a band that's been around for a very long time. They've got a lot of records out, and on the strength of what they stood for, what they did, the sound of the band, and the brand, there isn't a single original member in Napalm Death anymore. There isn't. There hasn't been for a long time. And like Shane Embury, he only makes some shows. He isn't on all the shows anymore, so they even have backups for him too. Is this the best album in the world? It isn't. It's kind of a mess. It's in spots. There's some great songs on it. It's more about what it did and what it says. It's a good cross-pollination of, punk and metal. It's grindcore. It influenced an entire genre. It still has a wow factor. If you put a normie in front of this and slap it in the CD player, it's going to invoke a reaction, provoke a reaction. I don't know. When I'm 79 years old in 2050, do you think I'm going to be turning people on like, you need to listen to this? I mean, probably not. But I just think that this album has done enough. I mean, for the band at least, that they're still going out there and functioning as Napalm Death in whatever iteration they're in now. I don't know. Napalm Death, it seemed like an interesting place to start that I didn't think anybody else would probably jump into, and I think it is a band and an album that inspired a lot. It crossed some expanses between genres, and it even introduced avant-garde experimentation. As they've gone on, they've incorporated saxophone and weird, crazy avant-garde stuff. So I think it's a band. It's always been a forward-thinking band and important to the grindcore scene.
Yeah. I thought about picking something from Napalm because of that, Godfathers of Grind kind of connection. So no, I can see where you're coming at from there. All
right, Lee, what's your second one? As you can see, my list is going to be weird, so get ready.
So I wanted to include some of the legacy bands, but then from the perspective of which ones which albums specifically do I think are going to hold up the most. And I was, whenever there's like a Judas Priest ranked or something, or I can get some kind of input from people, I always find it interesting because I found that a lot of folks that are my age or younger really resonate with Painkiller. Because
my kid loves that. He worships that record.
It's more extreme than British Steel and Screaming for Vengeance and all that. I think this thing personifies heavy metal so well. The cover, the sound, the double bass, this is the Judas Priest template that they've been doing ever since then, except for, those earlier things. But, with the Andy Sneap era, they've just been trying to basically make Painkiller. So, I think in 2050, if there's going to be a Judas Priest that's going to be remembered or be like the epitome of heavy metal, it will be Painkiller, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. If there's a Priest album that holds up, I think it would be that one. Yep, I think you've nailed it there, Lee.
All right, Kellen, your next one.
Okay, so this is my 90s choice. And the reason I went with this is I've always had a difficult time trying to pin down what exactly this band, where they fit. And we were moving more towards extremity, but I see this record in particular being sort of their standout, and the one that I would recommend. It also is influenced in more and more bands that I think are playing in, I would call it just extreme metal now. That is Mortuary's Drape with Sucrasundaria. So this band from Italy, they do a lot of weird, it's black metal, it's death metal, it's kind of doomy. But when I listen to Negative Plane or even parts of Malacarpatan nowadays, this is a certain kind of band that never got a whole lot of attention or love. their influence I hear more and more often now, 2 decades later. And I think because of that, to the way people consume music now, this is going to be far more accessible to fans in 2050 and visible in a way that the previous generation didn't have access to it. So I think this band will continue to grow, and sort of this record will appreciate over time in a way that's not necessarily big now, but will increase in sort of its relevance and in purpose over the years.
All right. Duane.
I'm digging the younger guys, man. You're making me
Me and
feel
Kellen are
old.
tackling this so
Thanks.
differently.
Really
I was
making
gonna
me
say
feel
we
old.
won't put that quote out there too much.
Oh, no.
I really dig the younger guys, but
Lori Drape. Yeah.
we won't put that
Okay,
on a shirt.
So again, the way that I went about this is a band that's still going, legacy band in my eyes, and lots to choose from in this discography, that's for sure. But this was, I think, the quintessential album for this band that, again, I see, in 2050, if you're going to build a metal collection, this just has to be one of those albums, even today. I still see it in 2050. Just like if you're going to build a rock collection today, you still have to get, Jethro Tull Aqualung, right? I mean, it's just, there's certain albums, like I said, that are still relevant. And what this album did, and the influence this album had, hell, even just one song on here, but this album especially, Accepts Restless and Wild, is a quintessential record.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
This
Inspired
was-
thrash.
Yeah, this was the birth of, it started here.
Yeah.
And this was the band, going from a 6-cylinder to an 8-cylinder, unfortunately, they didn't follow it up with something this strong, but this was their coup de grace moment, So I still see this being relevant in 2050. I still play it, to this day. Yeah, probably once every couple months. It gets spun at least once, I would say. So, Restless and Wild by Accept.
All right. Ellen.
All right. Duane mentioned these guys in passing on his first pick, and they're in my stack. I think this album will still be of a lot of interest to folks in the future. Venom's black metal, and I do agree with Duane. Now, Venom has a certain cartoonishness to them, and I don't think that's what's going to be the appeal. And it's not just that Venom. Like I said, a lot of my picks I'm leaning towards things that are more extreme. So there's that to this. But the big thing here is I feel like there's going to still be a lot of interest in black metal moving forward. That's a style, whether you like it or not. That genre has proved that it has a lot of legs, that it has evolved, and importantly, it's diversified into a lot of different little subgenres.
Yeah.
There's it's its own little underground of different sounds and styles, and there are still a lot of new bands that are making new black metal that's interesting. There's already bands, there's a cottage industry of just aping Dark Throne albums, and those bands still can do relatively well just copying the classics. So I foresee black metal persisting for quite a while moving forward. And because of that, there's always going to be that tendency, like, where did it come from? And it's like, well, it came from right here. That people are still going to be at least curious to go back and hear this album, to hear, the origins of black metal. So, and that's why I ended up picking this one over, say, Welcome to Hell. It's not necessarily about Venom's musical quality that's going to sell people and keep them listening to Venom. But people are going to come back to this album because this is the one that spawned the name, that spawned the genre, that spawned the reboot in Norway. All of these, very famous chain of events that will be remembered. It all gets traced back to here, and metal fans kind of like to do a lot of that kind of homework and see where things originated. So I think black metal by Venom, that people would still feel like I do need to check that out at least once as a black metal fan in the future.
Good pick. Solid. And let's go to one of the bands that they inspired. De Mysterious Dom Satanas by Mayhem.
Mm-hmm.
And on the basis of musical content alone, this could stand on its own 2 feet. But once you add the true crime element to this, that was the first time I ever heard of Norwegian black metal. I heard all of the crime that was going on, the church burnings, the murders. It was intriguing. This and the split Hordanis land with enslaved, the Emperor enslaved split were the first 2 black metal CDs I ever bought. Bought them on the same day. So what makes this special? Well, the playing style. You've got a new, they're playing bar chords, but they're picking all 6 strings. That's kind of the Norwegian sound. Snorre, what's his name, Roosh or whatever from Thorns kind of revolutionized that style of picking. Euronymous Snorre was in the band before. So it rubbed off on Euronymous, and this stuff is very melodic. There's a unrelenting feel to it. There's a darkness to it. And then you add the vocal skills of Attila to it, who came from the Hungarian band Tormentor. And he was also in a industrial band called Plasma Pool. So he's very much an ogre from Skinny Puppy vocal. So he has a completely unique approach to black metal singing that there's so many people that are like, I prefer Dead. I get it. Dead was more the orthodox style, the traditional black metal style, whereas Attila took it to creative heights, I think. He made this album more twisted and darker, and it remains, they got more advanced, technically challenged as they went forward. But I think this, to this day, still stands up as their most important piece. It's an important piece for black metal, even though it came out late. And that whole movement, and it influenced a ton, and they're still doing it. So I think in 2050, this album has to be in the conversation when you're talking, showing this to somebody. What is black metal? You have to have Venom's black metal, and you have to have this as well, because that, again, there's a decade span there that they influence it influenced it. So yeah, Mayhem.
No, that's a really good pick, Marty. And I thought about that one. I just went further back to to Venom as black metal. But yeah, if folks are not interested in something as archaic as Venom, then yeah, that's probably the one they go back to as a starting point.
All right, Lee, you're back in the rotation here. What you got?
Yeah, I'm gonna bring up a band that I don't think has really come up in the chat. It's kind of hard to figure out an album, but Typo Negative, Bloody Kisses.
He was, Pete Steele was mentioned earlier in the evening.
Oh, well.
In the chat guys were talking about him. Yeah.
Good point. I think the reason why is you have Pete Steele as being has that star power. Everyone's going to remember him. He kind of has that gone too soon element as well.
Yeah.
And I feel like ever since the death, the band has actually become more and more popular, more, almost mythic. And then, of course, just the music. I think the music appeals to hardcore fans. It appeals to metal fans. It appeals to goth fans. It appeals to people of any gender, which I think also is important in terms of numbers.
It's that original touch I was talking about.
Yeah.
It's only theirs. It's just
exactly.
Theirs.
So I do think this band's just going to continue to climb in terms of popularity. And frankly, if they just had let's say, for instance, all of a sudden, in the next season of Stranger Things, a Typo Negative track is in one of those episodes. Kids would eat it up. It's ripe for it. So I think that if for some reason a big licensing opportunity came like that, it could give them even another boost. Not that they might want it, but I think the catchy tunes and the melody is just going to hold up over time.
Good pick.
Yep, that's an excellent call, Lee.
Kellen.
Okay, so this next one for me, when I guess is my generation, right? This is a mid 2000s pick.
Here
As
comes
my-
Yattering, a Yattering CD.
my millennial generation. But I guess I want to take a quick moment because I think Al made an interesting point about leaning towards more extremity. And this is the next record's from a genre that I think we've been, or I guess heavy metal has yet to kill or has yet to die off. Every successive generation, it doesn't move very much, doesn't move that quickly at all. But it refuses to die. And the era in which it emerged, I think, is by comparison and contrast important to me. So this is Gates of Slumber, So for No Guilt. And the reason I chose this was it's a Doom record from the mid 2000s. If you think about what's happening in America with Doom, I mean, this is the era of ISIS, of Cult of Luna, of Sun O. Like, is that a sound that you hear now at all today? Like, it's pretty much gone. That sort of post-metal stuff, I don't think is a part of it, where Doom metal maybe is the first genre that you could associate within heavy metal, and it still persists today. It is yet to die out. There's still bands coming out in it. So I think 20 years later, you're still going to want a Doom record, and this is the one from my era.
Good pick.
Good pick.
Good pick, and agreed with everything you said on that.
All right. Duane, what you got?
Well, so talk about all over the place with me. And the way I see this one is, again, like, you know, Marty, I think you brought it up about, maybe it was Alan. One of you said something about how, like, in the 70s, metal, I think it was Alan, metal was like Deep Purple, and, you know, and to us, that seemed more like just classic rock.
Yep.
Well, sure, this album I'm going to show, a lot of people probably consider this like dad rock now, for sure. But in the pyramid of heavy metal history, this is definitely one of those strong bricks that you could not build the pyramid without, because it captures a moment in metal history for sure. And that's Motley Crue's Shout at the Devil. So this was kind of like the follow-up you had in the early 80s. In the mainstream, you had Quiet Riot come out with a #1 record, right? First #1 heavy metal record. And then you had like the Stay Hungry by Twisted Sister. And after that, you got hit with this. Now, this is mainstream metal that I'm talking about. And this was, you know, you got the Pentagram and whatnot, and Shout at the Devil. And, you know, this was before, you know, Home Sweet Home and the frilly lace and pink and all that crap. This was, to this day, still one of my favorite gatefold images of any album. But this was a monumental record in heavy metal, for sure. And still the band's best in my opinion. And I think in 2050, looking back, again, this is going to be a mandatory, I think, there's going to be a lot of interest in this phase of metal, and that's the LA scene. You know, what that scene spawned is huge. You know, is it as heavy as death metal or thrash or anything like that? Absolutely not. But it still has its place. And this is one of the most important albums, I believe, in that category. And I think will still be sought after then.
All right. Alan.
Yeah, Crue's an interesting one. I mean, I don't think that style is going to be very popular in the future. I mean, I don't see glam metal having another turn on the cycle. But if there's a band that does retain some interest, just because they really did become sort of, they're the party band. They're the band where everyone's got to show their tits. They're the band that was kind of the kings of debauchery, and that kind of thing will always have a certain currency in people's minds.
Sleaze sells.
It does, and yeah, Crew's legacy, just the legend around that band may keep the interest up, even if the music's not that popular. So yeah, that's a good pick, Duane. Let's see, another one for me, kind of just again sticking very much in the extreme side of things. I debated on which album to pick for this band, but I eventually decided it should be this one, Death's Leprosy. It's not the first death metal album, of course. It's not even the first death album, but throughout my lifetime and my little narrow window of existence, this has always seemed to be the album that a lot of people connected with as like the classic in their catalog. Like Marty, I know you go back to Scream Bloody Gore a lot more often and stuff.
That was my first one.
Yeah. And to be clear, Leprosy is not my favorite death album. I'm not picking it for that reason, but it seems for a lot of folks this was either their introduction to the band or their introduction to the style of death metal, or it was just the first album that really grabbed them and said, "Whoa, forget about thrash metal, forget about traditional metal. This is my thing now."
Yep.
And of course, death metal has proven itself to be very resilient as a style. It had its moment there, late 80s into the early 90s, and it kind of died off, but it never completely went away. It's currently, probably an oversaturated scene. There's a little bit too much, retro nostalgia, copycat stuff going on for it. But death metal has also always found, ways to do different things. Bands found ways to be more technical. Bands found ways to be more brutal. Bands found ways to be super gross and, go over the top in more of a slam direction. They found ways to make melodic death metal, into its own niche that works quite well for a lot of fans. So, it's often, considered like, the opposite of black metal, the yin and yang or whatever, but they both have done well as styles. They're both still considered to be kind of the right there the most extreme types of metal going today, and that probably persists a fair well into the future. And Death just has a lot of things going for it. They were one of the first bands, if not the first band, kind of on that scene. They've always been held as one of the real innovators in that scene. Yes, some people aren't as into what Chuck was doing in the 90s maybe, but for a lot of people those albums are mind-blowing. They are touchstones. And Chuck has that same kind of appeal that Lee mentioned for Pete Steele. Gone too soon. What else could that particular dying young always has a real currency in heavy metal, or not metal, but in music through the generations.
Culture and pop culture.
Yeah, even in pop culture, Dean Martin and Jane Mansfield still have a certain resonance 70 years later just because they died young and pretty. There's always those what if questions. They didn't have time to grow old and piss us off by turning into crazy people.
James Dean? You said Dean Martin, and that's not. You said Dean Martin.
Oh, sorry. Yes,
yeah,
I meant James.
James Dean. Yeah.
Yep.
Like Dean Martin was old and.
Yeah. No. Yep. Just misspoke. Sorry. Thank you, Marty. So Chuck has that kind of working in his favor in this regard. The Death catalog. It's relatively short. It's not a catalog that's going to scare people away because it's 25 albums long or something. It's not got any particular weak links in it. Again, people may like different eras more or less, but it's one of those bands that even now, he's been dead 20 years, and it's people still basically this is the S tier for death metal. This is the level every band aspires to try to get up there close to. So I think maybe it's not Leprosy, maybe it ends up being one of the other albums, but I think something in Death's catalog is definitely still held in really high regards well into the future. So that's my pick for number 3. Marty,
good one for sure. I am still kind of in the Norwegian scene here a little bit, and I had a hard time picking between the first two albums, but had to go within the Night Side Eclipse. Again, Anthems to the Welcome to Dusk is probably the right answer here, but I think there's just some complexity that happened on this that might be a little bit more to take than this album for the start jumping off point. Again, a whole genre scene born out of controversy, criminal activities, and this band was also touched by that a bit as well. But well, quite a bit actually. But this album for me is in their catalog. It's kind of like the same thing with Fate's Warning, Awaken the Guardian. There's an emotional component to this music. It's very atmospheric. It's very spacious. It's very symphonic. Yet the songs at the core, the riffs are very necro, simplistic even. There's a good flow and spirit in the movement of the songs. Whereas Anthems starts to get a little bit more convoluted by busier riffs, more layers. Starts to get to be a challenge to listen to. You really have to work at it. And once it clicks, it sits with you. This here, I think, is a more immediate connection. Again, the darkness and evil side of this atmosphere is kind of second to none on this album as far as I'm concerned. But I think, like Alan mentioned, I think black metal in 2050 is still going to have a relevance, and you can't really not talk about the genre and not discuss this album at the very least, because it is very transformative, and it shows that the musical development that can go into it. There's a lot of classical instrumentation on here. So, yep, I think this album and this band had a lot to offer, and it would be good to share with people down the road.
Yeah, some folks have been picking that one in the comments. So, yep, you're on the same wavelength.
All right. Lee.
All right. So number 4, I, in preparation, was thinking about my personal taste, but from a macro perspective, looking at like what is the highest rated metal album of all time, and like what metal fans really, really love. And this one came up frequently as like number 1 to 5.
Oh, love that.
I
My
mean,
favorite. It's a favorite record
yeah.
for sure.
Like
Great
perfect
pick.
guitar album.
Yep. It's the best Megadeth album, hands down.
For sure. Just catchy songwriting. I mean, anyone who plays guitar in the future is going to be amazed by this thing, and it's beyond that too. Amazing songwriting. I think they really just captured something completely unique on this. Like, this is Megadeth. You know, they weren't trying to be Metallica or follow in their footsteps as much. I felt like this was everything just kind of firing in all cylinders. Perfect epitome of like what metal is, and it's that right level of extremity that will still remain metal, in my opinion, in 2050 instead of being considered dad rock. So I think it'll be on that list personally.
Agreed. That's a great pick.
Yep.
Excellent album.
Kellen.
Okay, so the next one here, it's 2050. So I kind of wanted to get closer into the 2000s and start pulling records, because I just think at this point there's going to be enough, speculation in terms of what it sounds like. But let's talk about the diversity of black metal in terms of sound, and outside of classics like Venom and Emperor. This is Two Hunters, Wolves in the Throne Room.
Good pick.
The sound of this record, I think, as this is 2007, it's coming up here on 2 decades. And to me, in a lot of ways, like what Emperor did for symphonic black metal, I think this record influenced a lot of bands who are chasing this sound.
And it's a good snapshot of an entire scene. The whole Cascadian black metal scene had a lot of stuff that was similar to that.
And how it sort of splintered off and influenced different sort of post black metal stuff. It's for me, like, I don't know how much Cascadian black metal I necessarily need in my collection, but if I have to pick one, it's this record. And then on top of that, I think over the following decades, more and more black metal and black metal adjacent genres are going to be looking at this as sort of a template. So in 2050, you know, this is probably, I if I had to guess, in terms of records that have been released in the 21st century that will play a major role in shaping the sound of the genre, this is going to be the first one that I recommend.
All right. Good one. Duane.
Boy, you guys are making me feel really old here. I knew the young guys be pulling, heavy stuff. Marty and Ellen tend to be on the really heavy side too. So I got all your classic old shit.
Grandpa, tell us a story.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
all right.
I was trying to go at it as legacy bands that are still going that would have albums that are still relevant in 2050. So this is this band's, I don't know, this is their Abbey Road, their Dark Side of the Moon, what have you. And if I don't show it, I'll have to turn in my fan club card. But Maiden's Number of the Beast. I think even in 2050, someone says, "What's that?" Yeah, I remember my dad, this band Iron Maiden. What does it sound like? This is what you give them. This is what you give them. And then they can go from here, either direction, back or forward. But this is where it starts, in my eyes. It's got their best track ever on here. It's got a couple of what some people consider clunkers, yet I can't imagine the album without them. And again, this is an album that it's the whole album. The whole picture's here in both sides of this album. This isn't, I submit this album because of this one song or these two songs or whatnot. No, it's the whole album. This was a defining moment in the band. I mean, this is this band's Dark Side of the Moon. That's all I can say. And when you're talking about a legacy act, there's one of the biggest right here. So, and it's my favorite record of all time, so I have to include it. If I didn't, I wouldn't be able to go to sleep tonight. So there you go.
All those bootlegs would have to go back to Jurgen,
Yeah,
and that's such a pain. It's a pain.
Too much work, man. For
All
one
right.
slot, of course.
Alan, what are your thoughts on your next pick?
Let's see. One quick follow-up. Kellen's pick, very, very good. Not only because of its effect on Cascadian black metal. Wolves is in the conversation for most popular American black metal band, but also one of the bands that really helped legitimize U.S. black metal. We've talked about it before. U.S. black metal bands, it's always been seen as not as good as the European stuff. But there came a point in the early and mid 2000s where some American black metal bands really did start to plant their flag and be like, no, look, we're not just a poor copy of what happened in Norway. And Wolves is one of those bands, and that is one of those albums. So yeah, I did not think of Two Hunters, but that's a very good pick from Kellen.
Great pick. Yeah.
Because again, I think just for people interested in American black metal, that's one of the albums that really took it out of the oh, that's cute, you think you're copycatting Scandinavia, and saying like, no, we're not. We're doing our own thing, and we're doing it really damn good. My pick here is going to be a split pick, and I don't have too much to say about it, and that's just because I want to highlight that Lee keeps stealing my shit. First off, yes, Metallica's Black Album was very much one of my picks. I don't own
Fight that guy
it,
anyway.
I
God.
just pulled up the picture. But I mean, Lee's absolutely right. I mean, the sheer volume of sales on this album means that it's not going anywhere anytime soon. I don't like the album. We've discussed that more than enough. But this isn't about what I like. This is about what people will still be wanting to hear and still be considered, essential by a lot of people in the future. And this album is just not going to go away. And he really keeps stealing my stuff. And I agree on this one. I picked it for the exact same reasons Lee articulated. There are always going to be people who want to be guitar heroes, who are going to be drawn to that instrument. This album is always going to blow them away. And while it's not as, heavy or as extreme as some of the other stuff I've been picking, like Lee said, it's heavy enough to still, have that kind of dangerous edge to it. But the songs are still accessible enough that people can listen to it. They're catchy. You remember these songs quickly. It's not, a bunch of, complexity that never comes a song. So, yeah, I had those two as kind of my thrash duo. So just they get second votes from me on Lee's excellent picks there.
All right. Well, I hope I don't shit in your cereal even further here, because this is very much an Alan pick, but there you go.
No, I didn't pick it.
You didn't pick it?
That's so funny. I didn't pick it because I knew one of you guys were going to pick it.
Well, you can't. This is the
Time to
godfather of European power metal. And this has to always be in the conversation as far as I'm concerned. Not only for its relevance and what it did, is what it still is. I mean, you listen to this record, it's still great. The production's great. The songs are great. The guitar playing, the singing is legendary. I mean, this is
I'll
excellent.
be honest. I was torn between any one of the first three.
Yeah, my first one was Walls of Jericho, but no, I think this has got more cultural significance in the metal community moving forward. I mean,
I agree.
It does.
it's just I think Halloween, Walls of Jericho, the self-titled, timeless, amazing music, awesome speed metal, but it was very much a product of its time. They were trying to be Creator. It doesn't sound like Creator, but it still sounds German. It still sounds frantic, and here we go. That's right.
Pass
Drink.
the shot glass.
Pass the shot glasses around, but there you go. Look at it, take it in, revel in its greatness. If you don't have it, go buy it, because it's classic. And they should still be talking about that one down the road for sure. Lee, I think we're on our last round here.
We are.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is just another one of those where just different generation looking at like, what are all the headlines in the metal publications? It's like, what is Corey Taylor talking about? Is the next album going to be as heavy as Iowa? So I had to pick it. I do think Slipknot Iowa will be remembered and added to that list, mostly because of the changing of the guard. I do think this album is solid. It has a lot of death metal influence. Of course, they have their whole imagery. They have a sometimes very annoying fan base, but pretty solid record. But if I had my own personal pick, I would love this album to be remembered in 2050, personally. I love this record so much. Ghost Reveries by Opeth. Very formative album for me when I was in my teenage years. I still remember having an iPod video and watching Grand Conjuration on repeat. And I think it's a very cinematic and thematic album. And since Opeth has kind of shifted their sound, albums like this, I think, have even more value and return to them. But in terms of numbers, I do think this will be remembered as one of the new metal albums that ages well, personally.
That's a good call. Yeah. Not my band. I would never have thought of it, but yeah, I would agree.
All right, Kellen.
So I wanted to pull a death metal record, and I thought about, pulling an Ulcerate record. We talked about them not that long ago, and it'd be an avant-garde modern death metal record.
Yep.
To highlight, but I want to go a different direction. So my choice for a band and an album that will be remembered in 2050, I think a key point here is making sure that the band is active for a long period of time. I don't know how much that builds in terms of a legacy, but I do think that keeps your name circulating. And if you continue to make at least decent records, I think that will help in terms of longevity. So a band and the record that I'm choosing is Hooded Menace and Never Cross the Dead. This would be, I think, a band that stuck around for a long time. And while their sound has evolved, through the years. I do think it's a classic. I wanted to pick a record that had been released relatively recently. And I think this band's built enough of a catalog to where I do think they are worthy of consideration. I did a video earlier this year talking about Dead Congregation. That's a band that I think was incredibly influential, but I don't know if down the years, I think they'll be remembered just because they weren't as active. So this is a band that is continued to put out good work. I do think out of all the death metal bands that have emerged over the past 15 years, they're one that's been very consistent and probably should be remembered. So that's my last choice there.
Oh, nice pick, Kellen. Yep.
Yeah.
Good reasoning.
Ellen.
Duane.
Sorry.
Oh.
I'm trying to keep up with the chat. I'm like,
No, it's
struggling
good.
to keep
Mark
everything-
doesn't like me anymore.
I'm sorry.
He doesn't like my picks.
You only get 4, Duane.
After that Motley Crue, we minus one.
Sorry, but it had to be.
Sorry.
I still
Yeah.
stand by it.
I'm kidding.
Shout at the
Lee
Marty.
also- with Lee also and Alan, like I said, I picked the Black Album too, and basically for the same reasons. I mean, to me, my favorite Metallica is Ride the Lightning. Okay, but for history's sake, it is what it is. You can't argue it, right? So, also for me, the band stops there. Sorry, Metallica fans, but that's where, right there. So as a backup, I got a few I could have chose. I'm going to go ahead and show this because he's gotten no love yet tonight. And again, there's 3 albums. I was torn on which one to pull here because to me, I think they're all essential and will still be essential in 2050. And I closed my eyes and pulled one. This is the one I pulled, so I'm sticking with it. And that's Ozzy's Blizzard of Oz.
Oh yeah.
Could also pick Diary of a Madman. Could have picked No More Tears for the same reason as the Black Album. That was his biggest selling record.
Could have picked Sabotage.
But this
Such an
album
iconic
here,
voice.
very important album, very important record, and I don't think it'll ever age. It's just my opinion, of course, but yeah, I think in 2050 you'll still walk into a record store and find a shrink-wrapped copy of this new sitting in the bin.
I would not be surprised.
Yep.
So,
I mean, sporting events will keep Crazy Train alive.
yeah, all right.
Yep.
Yeah.
You know.
I mean, a voice that iconic. I mean, between Sabbath and his solo material, I mean, his musical legacy, I mean, will outlive him forever. I mean, it's really, long as there's a heavy metal,
One of the greatest opening tracks on a metal record with I Don't Know. Love it. Mr. Crowley being one of the first like spooky kind of songs I remember.
Yeah.
Crazy Train, obviously one of the most iconic riffs. When you heard that song for the first time, man, anybody that has not heard that song and they're going to hear it for the first time, I envy you because that is a magical moment. That record's just got so much.
Yeah. No, good pick.
And to be honest, I don't want to keep going, but
you're fine.
What it proved to Ozzy himself too. Okay, so it was, because when he was kicked out of Sabbath, he was at the gutters, bottom of the gutter. If it wasn't for Sharon, I can't stand her, but if it wasn't for her and getting him to do that and him creating that, he, that changed his life and he became who he is,
Yep.
So just everything about that album is so important. Okay, I'm done.
All right.
I'm done. I'm here. Someone else can go now.
All right, Alan, what you got?
Yeah. No, that's a really good pick, Duane. I mean, yes, you've got the most recognizable figure in heavy metal history, bar none. You've got, yes, like Lee said, you've got one of the anthem songs that every 6-year-old to 80-year-old knows because it's in every commercial and every sporting event. And you've also got again that Gone Too Soon allure with Randy Rhoads on the album, which draws in again the whole guitar worship component that Lee and I were talking about with Megadeth. So yeah, there's a lot going for.
It spawned many
Ozzy.
a metal guitarist for sure.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that album, should have a ton of legs going forward. Great call. All right, let's see. Well, I'm going to go to my first alternate because somebody named Lee kept picking all my stuff. But, I had a couple, and this kind of goes back to might have been your first pick, Marty. I mentioned that I considered Napalm Death for the grind connection. I decided to go in a slightly different direction as an alternate, and went with Carcass Symphony. I went with Symphonies instead of their first album just because that first album's messy.
It's a mess.
Let's just be honest. For a lot of folks that like this style, that album is.
I never listened to it.
This is the one I think that really cements that sound. And again, just the cover art, the presentation. This is the album that has spawned so many clones, and inspired so many bands to try to be. Can they out extreme this? And maybe somebody has, maybe somebody hasn't. I don't know. But again, I really do think a lot of it's going to be the more extreme stuff that people still want to investigate in the future. And Carcass, yes, Napalm's there too. Certainly don't fault you for picking Napalm instead of this. It could have been either one.
I listen to Carcass way more than I listen to Napalm Death, but
I do too. I can see people picking Napalm because yes, they were a little earlier on the scene, maybe a little more influential, and had a broader sound, maybe more appeal in hardcore and punk and crust circles than Carcass. But it's sort of a coin flip between the two, and my coin landed on C for Carcass. So that's the one I picked for that kind of style of metal. So yep. Last honorable mention I'll throw up because it's the last one on my stack. I consider Domination by Morbid Angel, just again as one of those kind of epitome of death metal albums that's held up well. The reason it's on the bottom of my stack, and you can see what you all think. Kellen mentioned, it's kind of important that you have a band maybe that had enough time, to really cement themselves. While Morbid Angels had the time, it also feels like you got to a certain point in their career and it was just this kind of, slow downward and then this big drop. I don't know how much people are going to remember Morbid Angel for anything past, around this point. Does anything happen after Communion that people consider essential or not? They have their fans, but I'm just not sure the band's overall body of work is going to hold up, and as such, people may not come back to Communion as much as they might say, the Death catalog. I think I said Domination at one point earlier. Sorry.
I think
but,
Altars,
that's
too.
why. I'm sorry, what, Lee?
Altars of Madness for sure will be remembered. Just iconic cover, and also like that early death metal sound. I think it's probably top 10 best death metal albums ever. Although I probably listen to Covenant more nowadays, but Altars of Madness, man.
Yep, no one's picked that yet. Maybe, but Marty has one left to show. Maybe we spoiled the lead for Marty here.
No, my another weird pick, but I think this is, if it isn't talked about in a bunch of years, it should be, because I showed this the other night on here for something. I don't remember what it was for, but In Flames Jester Race. Why did you pick this record? Well, because this record was kind of a voice of a Swedish movement. I mean, there was a Left Hand Path and, like an ever-flowing stream. It kind of launched a million HM2 bands. Still to this day, bands are chainsawing it up in their guitar tone. This was the Swedish, the Melodeath scene was huge. And this band was at the forefront of it. And this album, The Jester Race, you're not going to find a more catchy, melodically bloated, in a good way, album than The Jester Race. Every song on here is just well written from start to finish, amazing guitar harmonies, and those in-key guttural vocals just fit so perfectly with it. It was like the juxtaposition between, ultra brutal vocals, yet down-tuned, but very melodic and moving, emotional riffs and songs. This is a great album, and it's one of those that should definitely stand the test of time. At the time this came out, I loved it, and I liked a lot of the bands that it spawned, but it got to a point where oversaturation happened really quick with this sound and this style in Sweden. There was so many bands. I mean, yeah, between this band and At the Gates, they inspired so many bands. It's ridiculous. But for me, Jester Race by In Flames. Jester Flames, yeah.
I have got to bring something up real quick.
Yeah.
Because this has been fun and it's made me think of something. And that's, to all the youngins out there, you'll realize this if you haven't already started to. But so we're talking 2050, right? That's what we set as the mark, right? In 2050.
I'll probably be dead.
No, I want you to hear me out for a minute. That is 26 years from now. Okay? So 26 years ago was 1998. Okay, and there's albums still on my shelf that I still consider absolutely phenomenal mandatory albums that are from that year or area, right there, late 90s, right? That wasn't that long ago. And 25 years will go by really quick.
Yeah, it does.
It goes by really quick. And so 25 years from now, is really not that far off. It's really not that far off. When you look at some of the old stuff, like let's say Led Zeppelin, which still sells millions of records every year, right? Those albums are 50 years old, right? 50 plus years old. So, that shows you how long this stuff can last, actually,
Yeah.
So, this has been great because whether it's me showing the more classic stuff and you guys showing some of the more, modern, heavier stuff, it's all relevant, I believe. I think everything we've shown tonight is still going to be relevant in 2050 because I don't think it's going to change that much by then. Because it goes by, that 25 years is actually a pretty short amount of time. Pretty short.
That's a good point. And also I get to thinking about Alan's point on, his dad's music was very, no one talks about Elvis anymore, but think about it. The bands that your dad was into and collected, I think there are more bands now than there were back in those days. There was still probably a bazillion bands, don't get me wrong, but there was only so many bands that were making it onto the radio. And I don't know if doo-wop and all that early rock and roll stuff had an underground. I just don't. I think it was all made by hit makers trying to get to the radio singles.
There was a very big underground for it too. Yeah,
Was it?
proportional given the world population was less than 50% of what it is now. But yeah, no, though there's plenty of deep dives you can go into for those genres for folks that are into it.
It's a lot harder to make music back then, though. I mean, now you can make music on your phone.
Oh yeah.
Yep. Hell, now you can just tell your AI to whip you out a song in the style of Iron Maiden, and it's going to be about TPs on the Great Frontier and
playing an instruments for suckers.
Yeah.
Yeah, but no, and to go back to that too, Marty, not to Elvis and some of those kind of cultural icons have faded a lot. Some of those other older styles have held up very well and are very resilient. A good example of that is blues. Well, yes, like a lot of the Elvis records in my dad's collection aren't worth a fraction of what they used to be. A lot of the blues records are more expensive than they were 30 years ago. That particular style has held up and has had a ton of cross-generational appeal, and people do still want to go back and collect some of that stuff. And it's not just people his age. You do get some younger folks that want to hunt down, the Lightning Hopkins and, the Lazy Lesters and, that kind of stuff from that particular style of music. So, yeah, not everything, has, the same shelf life from that era.
I just had another thought.
Yeah.
What's probably going to sell in 2050, or kind of what we're getting at about all this, I got to be honest, what's probably going to sell is the best of Metallica, the best of Iron Maiden. Ozzy's greatest hits.
Well, it's kind of already those CDs already exist, you know, for a lot of bands. The best of
Yeah.
Nickelback.
It'll be the playlists of that.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So maybe not so much a particular album, but
Oops.
you know, a comp or something like that.
Yep.
Right.
Garage Days revisited. The really best of Metallica.
Right. Well,
Good
did we
deal.
get through the whole dang thing?
I believe we did. Any closing thoughts that anybody wants to offer as we wrap up here?
I should have a quick question for Alan on the blues note side of things. So for they're maybe collecting, let's say, like Delta blues records from the 1940s. Is anyone collecting blues records from the 1970s or the 1980s? Like, meaning there's still new musicians coming out with that, right? But does it have any value or currency, even though they may be sort of replicating? I know you've talked about this note before, but if the idea is that we're sort of reproducing certain sort of sounds, and with current artists being still legitimate decades, like, do you think? I'm just curious if that holds in the same way that we're talking about heavy metal today.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't know for sure since it's not a scene I keep up with, especially that kind of later 20th century blues. I do feel like there's interest has crept forward some, that there's maybe more interest like in some of
Stevie
the
Ray Vaughan.
mid 60s, late 60s, and into the early 70s at least, kind of blues stuff than there might have been 20 or 30 years ago. So I think that at least some of that is getting more attention than it used to. I don't know about stuff from the the 80s forward. So yeah, I can't say for sure.
Kind of along the same lines, though, it definitely what is very big is jazz from that era. Does extremely well.
Right, like I think so for me, when I think about this era of heavy metal in the 1980s, right, like I'm just curious at how a genre or a record sort of gains notoriety and appreciates over time. Like for you, if you were to listen to, like Iron Maiden's debut in 1980, by 1990, would it be a solidified classic, right? Like the genre throughout the 1980s had changed so much and had diversified that it took 10 years and people were like, it's a legitimate classic, right? So now I don't feel that same time frame operates in the same way. Like I think for a record for us to consider to be a classic in the same way, because the genres evolve at a much slower pace, I think it takes a whole lot more time for us to, is it really a classic? I know it's been 15 years. I know it's been 20 years, but is it really a classic record? I just think that the pace of it has slowed a little bit just because.
I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious as to like, if I'm pulling, Hooded Menace from 2010, here we are in 2024 and we're like, well, is it really? It's been 14 years, but I feel like I have a greater threshold to pass.
Yeah.
So
I think it's a good point, Kellen, and I think you do have a greater threshold to pass because of what you said. Like for the first Iron Maiden album to be considered a classic 10 years later, it was competing with a much smaller pool of albums. For Hooded Menace to achieve that same kind of status, it's got to compete with an additional 24 years of albums that came out from 1990 to 2010, 2014, whenever that one came out. So, and I think that happens in like anything. It's not just heavy metal and it's not just records. That when there's something new, you're going to have some things quickly get elevated to that top tier. But as time goes by, it does get harder for later components to get up to that same tier simply because it's so much of it's accumulated.
Same thing.
And and it's not like those old ones. Those old ones don't get knocked down very easily. It's not like people suddenly forgot that one. It takes a long time for some of those things, like the Elvises, to cycle out. And in the meantime, everybody's getting compared not just to what's new and contemporary to them, but also to these decades of other stuff they've got to also sort of elbow their way through to get the spotlight to shine on them, for an equal share.
It's the same thing with Hollywood films. You kind of have that there too, especially like horror. To become a cult classic, now is going to take longer.
Good luck.
Classic.
Mm-hmm.
Good luck. Yeah.
So
Yep.
it's I think that's media in general. Whether it's music or film or even video games. I think
Yeah. It may be. I want to say off the top of my head, it's the same like in pick any professional sports thing, and who are the greats in the sports. People always will bring up the old ones. What does it take? When does Aaron Judge get put on the same platform as a Mickey Mantle or a Babe Ruth? You don't know. Again, he's got 100+ years of great baseball players that he's got to get compared against. Babe Ruth had a couple of decades of baseball players to get compared against. So, yeah.
The only thing is with sports, there's like statistics, very specific metrics,
yes,
especially
and that's
with
why
baseball.
I was not sure. I wanted to go in that rabbit hole, but yeah, there are other ways to measure that success.
Yeah. But,
yeah. Even that can get tricky because even the stats change. I mean, the statistics we use to measure baseball players today are not the same we used, in the 1980s. You can sit there and try to convert them, but
the baseball players today are not the same as they were then either.
And the technology behind baseball has changed. The bats are different. I mean,
it's
different. Mechanics behind sports and the way people train. I mean, look at Babe Ruth, the big old fat guy out there. I mean, you don't see many fat dudes running the bases in baseball. Sorry, you just don't. Of course, he run up there and crush them.
Yeah, that came up in the headlines with baseball in the past week. That somebody, and I forget which pitcher it is. He was within 0.3 miles per hour of setting a new record for fastest pitch ever. But they had to. Here we go. And so
and tonight, Marty is going to be stepping up to the plate.
He threw 105.4 miles per hour on a fastball, and it's like he was 0.3 miles per hour slower than the fastest pitch ever. But in the next paragraph, they're like, but to be honest, we're not really sure how that compares to older record holders because the instrument they use to measure pitch speed today changed in the past 10 years. The one they have now is more accurate than what was being used in the early 2000s. And that was an improvement over what was being used in the 20th century to measure speed pitch. Back then it was a radar gun, and everybody always knew that was underestimating speed pitch because it was often getting the velocity at the tail end when it came over the plate. And, the record holder for a long time was Nolan Ryan, and the fastest pitch that they had on record for him was thrown in the 8th inning of the game. He'd already been throwing for 2.5 hours at that point, but they didn't get an accurate reading on anything he threw for the first 6 innings or so. So yeah, that kind of stuff changes and messes with the stats and the records too. And yeah, the recording, you're right, Marty, getting back to music and metal, the recording technology has changed a ton.
Well, people's understanding of music and we've talked about this on here a bunch too, like drummers. I mean, when Fast as a Shark came out, that was the fastest song you could probably hear back then. But now look at the way drummers have pushed themselves to the point of not being able to go any faster. The swivel techniques on the kick drums and the precision gravity blasting.
Hell of a lot more of them doing it too.
Yeah. And they master the technique, and it becomes status quo. And that's just why it's, Lee talked early on about bands, music getting heavier and heavier. It's because it's getting the musicians themselves are progressing at such an alarming rate, and they're kind of pushing the levels of what a human body can do.
Yeah.
So,
but then you also start, hearing more and more behind the scenes stuff that they're not actually doing it. That it's all just, again, it's the trigger technology in the studio, and then when they have to do
fix
it live,
they just snap it to the grid. Yep.
Yeah, they just play it in the, they get a backing track to play live, and they're not even really doing it. They know what they want it to sound like, but they can't physically do it, so they lean on the technology to do things that drummers had no way to do in the past. Yeah. So once again, we've wandered through the weeds there a bit.
Yep. Well,
yeah. Any
it
other
was-
closing thoughts from folks?
anybody have any closing thoughts?
No.
Good topic, Duane. And thank you, Lee and Kellen, for joining us on the,
Yes, thank you,
journey.
guys.
Here.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks to
That
everybody
was
for
fun.
taking the
That
time,
was fun.
and thanks to everybody in the chat. There's been a very big audience tonight.
Huge
and
audience tonight.
folks have been very active in
126
the
at
chat.
one point.
So yeah, we really appreciate folks taking the time to participate and comment and join in on the discussion.
Best chat on the metal in the metal VC. You guys rule.
Nice.
Indeed.
Go
Marty,
check out
any,
Heavy Therapy. Oh, I'm sorry. Go check out
No, I was
Heavy
just saying, yes. Any show notes, please.
Heavy Therapy. Check out Killing for Company. Check out Lazerrus. All links are in the description. Wednesday, the album club is covering Failures for Gods by Immolation. I will not be here. I'm hoping Alan can step in for that. Maybe, if you can.
We'll talk. We'll see.
Okay. Yeah. And next Friday,
Next Friday, Jurgen comes. And,
Creator.
we are doing the Creator catalog.
right on.
Nice.
Whole lot of German thrash.
It'll be
Nice.
fun. Well, cool. Yeah, that's it. If no one has anything else, we're going to jump. Cheers, everyone. Had a great Friday
Night,
as always.
everybody.
You all rule.
See you guys.
Everybody hang out. Don't
Yeah.
hang up.
Have a good night.
Cheers.